Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Are they watching us, or are we watching them? The first snow of winter had transformed Oak Ridge into a picturesque postcard town, the kind tourists drive through and wish they could live in. But I knew better. I had spent 37 winters here, each one bleaker than the last, each one taking something from this place that never returned with the spring thaw. My name is Thomas Lowry, the town's only remaining doctor since the community hospital shut down 3 years ago. My modest clinic at the edge of town kept me busy enough, but not so busy that I couldn't notice the gradual decline of Oak Ridge, both in population and spirit. People simply packed up and left, often without explanation, leaving empty houses that no one seemed interested in buying. This morning, as I trudged through fresh snow toward my clinic, something caught my attention. At first, I thought it was simply an unusual pattern in the snow, perhaps where wind had swept across the surface. But as I drew closer, I realized what I was seeing, a perfect imprint of an eye, about the size of my palm, pressed into the snow. I crouched down, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The imprint was unnervingly detailed, eyelashes, iris, even a pupil that seemed to stare back at me. I reached out, hesitating a moment before pressing my fingertip to the center. The snow was firm, crystallized, unlike the powdery substance surrounding it. Neighborhood kids, I muttered to myself, standing up and brushing off my gloved hands. Yet even as I said it, I knew this was beyond the capability of any child snow art had ever seen. The wind picked up suddenly, sharp and biting against my exposed face. Something about it felt intentional, as if the cold itself had decided to single me out. I pulled my scarf tighter and continued toward the clinic, but couldn't shake the sensation of being observed. Inside, I flipped the sign to open and began my morning routine. The clinic was a small affair, just a waiting room, examination room, and my office. The heating system groaned as it fought against the plummeting temperatures outside. By noon, I had seen only 2 patients, Mrs. Hendricks with her arthritis that always flared up in cold weather, and young Billy Tanner who had managed to get frostbite on his fingers despite his mother's warnings about wearing gloves. I was reviewing some paperwork when the phone rang. Dr. Lowry speaking. Thomas? It's Elizabeth. Sheriff Rollins' voice came through, tense and professional. Something strange is happening out at the Reynolds place. Could use your expertise. Elizabeth Rollins had been sheriff for almost 20 years. She wasn't one for exaggeration or unnecessary panic. What kind of strange? I asked, already reaching for my coat. Medical strange. Or maybe. I don't know. Just come out here, will you? The Reynolds farm sat about 3 miles outside town. As I drove, I noticed more of those imprints in the snow, sometimes singular, sometimes in pairs, always staring upward. They lined the road at irregular intervals, becoming more frequent as I approached the farm. Sheriff Rollins' patrol vehicle was parked in the driveway, its lights cutting through the early winter dusk. She stood by the barn, arms crossed tight against her chest, not from cold but from discomfort. They're all over his property, Elizabeth said as I approached, not bothering with greetings. Old man Reynolds found the first one yesterday morning, but overnight. She gestured toward the fields. What I saw made me stop in my tracks. Hundreds, Perhaps thousands of imprints covered the snow-blanketed field. Perfect, identical impressions stretching as far as I could see in the fading light. Jesus, I whispered. That's not all, Elizabeth said, her voice unnaturally quiet. Follow me. She led me to the barn, where old man Reynolds stood guard by the door. He was in his 70s, stoic as always, but I could see fear etched into the weathered lines of his face. Show him, Frank, Elizabeth encouraged. Frank Reynolds nodded grimly and pushed open the barn door. The interior was dark save for a single hanging bulb that illuminated what appeared to be a normal barn floor until I noticed the frozen ground. Where the hay had been cleared away, the frozen earth was imprinted with the same eye pattern. Not one or two, but dozens, pressed into solid ground that by all rights should have been too hard to mark. These weren't here yesterday, Frank said, his voice cracking slightly. Ground's been frozen solid for weeks. I knelt beside one of the impressions, running my fingers along its edge. Unlike the snow imprints, these felt warm to the touch. Has anyone else been out here? I asked. Frank shook his head. Just me and the sheriff. And now you. A soft cracking sound drew our attention to the far corner of the barn. In the shadows, we could just make out the outline of another eye forming in the hard dirt, the ground splitting and reshaping itself as if molded by invisible hands. Elizabeth's flashlight beam caught something else, a glimpse of movement outside one of the barn's small windows. Something pale and fluid, like a face pressed against the glass, retreating just as the light found it. There's someone out there, she said, reaching for her sidearm. But when we rushed outside, the pristine snow showed no footprints other than our own. Nothing but those unblinking eyes, now seeming to follow our movements as we turned in confused circles. The wind picked up again, bringing with it a sound almost like whispering. I strained to hear, but the words, if they were words, remained just beyond comprehension. We should go, I said finally, unable to shake the creeping dread that had settled into my bones. All of us. Come back in daylight. Frank Reynolds looked at his property, at the house his grandfather had built, at the land his family had farmed for generations. I'm not leaving. Before either of us could argue, a lone moan swept across the fields, not the wind, but something using the wind. The sound of ancient pain and hunger. The eye imprints in the snow began to fill with a clear liquid that caught the last rays of sunlight, making them glisten like actual eyes watching us from the ground. Frank, Elizabeth said firmly, her hand on his arm. We're leaving. Now. As we hurried toward our vehicles, I glanced back one last time. In the gathering darkness, I could have sworn I saw the imprints blink. The drive back to town was tense with unspoken fears. I followed Elizabeth's patrol car closely, watching as she periodically checked her rearview mirror. Frank Reynolds sat beside me, his weathered hands clasped tightly together, knuckles white with strain. Been on that land 68 years, he said without looking at me. Never seen anything like this. I wanted to offer some rational explanation, perhaps a rare geological phenomenon or an elaborate prank, but the words died in my throat. What we had witnessed defied explanation. Main Street was deserted when we arrived, the storefronts dark except for the dim glow of security lights. Elizabeth suggested we meet at the town hall, one of the few buildings with a generator in case the storm knocked out power. I'll call Marcus from Public Works, she said as we entered the empty meeting room. Maybe he's heard of something similar happening before. While she made the call, I helped Frank into a chair and checked his vitals, elevated heart rate, but not dangerously so. The old man was tougher than he looked. Those things, Frank said quietly, They remind me of something my grandmother used to talk about. Old country superstitions. Eyes in the frost that watch for sinners. I was about to ask him more when Elizabeth returned, her expression grim. Marcus isn't answering. Neither is anyone at the Wilson household next door to him. She paused, chewing her lower lip. I'm going to do a drive-by, make sure everything's okay. I'll come with you, I offered, not wanting to be separated after what we'd seen. Frank insisted on joining us, and soon we were back in the patrol car, crawling slowly down the residential streets of Oak Ridge. The snow had stopped falling, but the temperature continued to drop, the cold becoming a physical presence that pressed against the windows of the vehicle. Marcus Haywood's house was dark when we pulled up. Elizabeth flashed her spotlight across the front, illuminating pristine snow covering the walkway, untouched, no footprints leading in or out. He could be out of town, I suggested hopefully. Elizabeth shook her head. Marcus never leaves during winter. Too worried about the water mains freezing. She directed the spotlight toward the house next door, the Wilsons, with similar results. No signs of life, no disturbance in the snow. I'm going to check inside, Elizabeth decided, reaching for her flashlight. Wait, Frank said suddenly, pointing toward Marcus's front yard. Look. In the snow, illuminated by the car's headlights, were the eye imprints, a dozen or more scattered across the yard. As we watched, the clear liquid began to fill them again, catching the light and gleaming with eerie awareness. They're here too, I whispered. Elizabeth steeled herself. All the more reason to make sure Marcus is okay. She exited the vehicle, gun drawn. I followed despite my better judgment, instructing Frank to lock the doors and honk if he saw anything unusual. The front door of Marcus's house was unlocked, unusual for a man as cautious as the public works director. Inside, the house was freezing cold, as if the heating had been off for days. Marcus? Elizabeth called, her voice echoing through the empty rooms. It's Sheriff Rollins. Are you home? We moved from room to room, finding nothing amiss yet everything wrong. The house was immaculate, not a thing out of place, yet covered in a thin layer of frost that couldn't have formed in just one night. The kitchen faucet dripped slowly, each drop freezing before it hit the sink, creating a strange, crystalline formation. In the living room, the television was on but displaying only static. The temperature seemed to drop further as we entered, our breath coming in clouds that hung in the air longer than seemed natural. Something's not right, Elizabeth murmured, stating the obvious. That's when we heard it, a soft scraping sound coming from upstairs. Elizabeth motioned for me to stay back as she approached the staircase, her footsteps deliberately loud to announce our presence. Marcus Haywood. This is Sheriff Rollins. Identify yourself. The scraping stopped abruptly. Then, a thud, as if something heavy had fallen. Elizabeth took the stairs two at a time, with me close behind despite her warning. The upstairs hallway was dark, the only illumination coming from Elizabeth's flashlight beam that cut through the gloom. The sound had come from the room at the end of the hall, Marcus's bedroom, based on the layout typical of these older homes. The door was closed. Elizabeth positioned herself to one side of the door, motioning for me to stay back. Marcus? I'm coming in. She turned the handle and pushed the door open in one fluid motion, her flashlight and gun entering the room before she did. The beam caught something reflective on the floor, a frozen puddle that stretched from wall to wall. The bedroom windows were open, snow and ice covering every surface. And there, in the center of the room, was Marcus Haywood. Or rather, what remained of him. His body lay face up, arms and legs spread in a grotesque parody of a snow angel. But where his eyes should have been were two perfectly round holes, extending deep into his skull, rimmed with frost. The rest of his face was untouched, frozen in an expression of absolute terror. Elizabeth cursed softly, moving closer to examine the body while I stood frozen in the doorway, my medical training momentarily forgotten in the face of such an impossible sight. The floor beneath Marcus creaked suddenly, the ice cracking as multiple eye imprints began forming around his body, pushing up through the frozen puddle. They formed rapidly now, no longer the slow process we had witnessed in the barn. "Elizabeth," I called urgently. "We need to leave. Now." She nodded, backing away from the body. As she did, Marcus's head turned, not his body, just his head, the neck cracking as it rotated to follow our movement. The eyeless sockets fixed on her, then on me, then back to her. Marcus's mouth opened, releasing not a sound but a cloud of freezing vapor that crystallized in the air, forming more tiny eye patterns that hung suspended like malevolent snowflakes. Elizabeth fired a shot instinctively, the bullet passing through the vapor cloud and lodging in the wall behind. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Marcus's body convulsed once, then went still, but the eye imprints continued to form, spreading outward from his body like ripples in a pond. We backed out of the room, slamming the door shut. Elizabeth's flashlight flickered, then went out entirely, plunging us into darkness broken only by the ambient glow of snow through the windows. A horn blared from outside, Frank, warning us of something. We navigated the dark hallway by memory and touch, rushing down the stairs and toward the front door. As we reached it, I glanced back and saw them, eyes, dozens of them, forming on the walls and ceiling of Marcus's house, all blinking in perfect unison. Outside, Frank was hitting the horn rhythmically, his expression panicked as he pointed toward the sky. Following his gesture, we looked up to see the stars blotted out by what appeared to be a massive cloud, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized the cloud was moving with purpose, swirling and reshaping itself. Within it, countless points of light winked and blinked, more eyes, watching from above. "Get in the car," Elizabeth ordered, her voice barely steady. "We're getting everyone out of town. Tonight." As we sped away from Marcus's house, I looked back one last time. The eye imprints in the snow seemed to track our movement, rotating in unison to keep us in their sightless gaze. And behind them, standing in Marcus's doorway, was a figure, not Marcus, something using his form, its head tilted at an impossible angle, observing our retreat with empty sockets that somehow saw everything. Elizabeth radioed for an emergency town meeting as we drove through the silent streets. Her voice remained calm and professional, betraying none of the terror I knew she must be feeling, the same cold dread that had settled in my own gut like a block of ice. "All residents are to gather at the community center immediately. This is not a drill. Bring warm clothing and essential supplies only." We passed house after house, Elizabeth activating her siren in short bursts to draw attention. Lights began flickering on, faces appearing in windows, confused, alarmed, but responding. In small towns like Oak Ridge, when the sheriff calls, people listen. Frank remained silent beside me in the back seat, his gaze fixed on the passing houses. Occasionally he would mutter something under his breath, prayers, perhaps, or old forgotten charms from his grandmother's stories. The community center was already buzzing with activity when we arrived. The mayor, Patricia Klein, had been among the first to respond to Elizabeth's call, organizing the space and calming the growing crowd. The large open room, usually used for town events and school basketball games, now served as an impromptu crisis center. "Elizabeth, what's going on?" Patricia demanded as we entered. Your message said something about an evacuation? We need to get everyone out of town, Elizabeth replied, keeping her voice low. Tonight. I've already called the neighboring counties for assistance with transportation. But why? The storm isn't that bad. It's not the storm, I interjected. There's something else. Something dangerous. Patricia's expression shifted from confusion to concern. She knew both of us well enough to recognize that we wouldn't suggest such a drastic measure without good reason. All right, she said finally. I'll help coordinate. But people are going to want explanations. Tell them it's a precautionary measure, Elizabeth suggested. Gas leak or water contamination, something believable but urgent. I moved through the growing crowd, checking for signs of the same affliction that had taken Marcus: frozen skin, unusual frost patterns, fixation on eyes. So far, everyone seemed normal, if understandably anxious. The community center windows faced the town square, giving me a clear view of the Central Park area where a large Christmas tree had been erected just days before. Now, in the glow of the streetlights, I could see the imprints surrounding it, dozens of them circling the tree like silent worshippers. Frank appeared beside me at the window, his withered hand gripping my arm with surprising strength. They're getting closer, he whispered. Moving in. He was right. The imprints I'd seen earlier that day had been stationary, fixed in the snow or ground where they formed. But these were shifting, slowly inching toward the community center like purposeful creatures. I was about to point this out to Elizabeth when the lights flickered, then went out completely. A collective gasp rose from the crowd, followed by nervous laughter and reassurances as emergency lights kicked on, bathing the room in a dim, bluish glow. Everyone remained calm, Patricia's voice echoed through the room. The generators will keep us warm until the power is restored. But I knew it wasn't a simple power outage. Through the windows, I could see that the entire town had gone dark, save for an eerie, pulsing illumination emanating from the imprints outside, each one now glowing with pale blue light that matched the emergency lighting inside. Elizabeth joined us at the window, her expression grim as she observed the approaching phenomenon. The evacuation buses won't be here for another hour, she said quietly. We need to keep everyone inside and away from the windows until then. A commotion at the entrance drew our attention. Two men were carrying a third, Jacob Wheeler, owner of the hardware store. His clothes were covered in frost, his skin pale with a bluish tinge. He collapsed outside his shop, one of the men explained as they laid Jacob on a table. Found him staring at those weird ice patterns in the snow. I rushed over, medical instincts taking over. Jacob's pulse was slow but steady, his breathing shallow. His skin was unnaturally cold to the touch, despite having been brought inside minutes ago. Jacob? Can you hear me? I bent closer, examining his eyes. They were normal at first glance, then I noticed the pupils. Instead of round black circles, they had taken on a distinctly angular shape, almost hexagonal. And within each pupil, I could swear I saw tiny reflections, countless miniature eyes staring back at me. Jacob's hand shot up suddenly, gripping my wrist with freezing fingers. His mouth opened, but instead of words, a cloud of crystalline particles emerged, swirling momentarily before my face before settling on my skin. Where they touched, I felt an instant, burning cold, followed by an overwhelming sensation of being watched from all directions at once. For a split second, my vision fragmented, as if I were seeing through multiple sets of eyes simultaneously, the community center from above, from below, from every corner and angle. I jerked back, wiping frantically at my face and arms. The sensation faded, but left behind a residual awareness, like phantom limb pain but for eyes I never had. Keep him isolated, I instructed, backing away. Don't touch his skin directly. And whatever you do, don't look directly into his eyes. Elizabeth pulled me aside, her voice tense. Is it contagious? I don't know, I admitted. But I think it's trying to spread. The temperature in the community center was dropping despite the generators. People huddled closer together, breath visible in the dim emergency lighting. Through the windows, the glowing eye imprints had reached the edge of the building, forming a complete circle around it. We need to tell them something, Patricia insisted, joining our huddle. People are scared. Before we could decide on a course of action, a young woman near the windows screamed. Everyone turned to see what had frightened her. Outside, standing at the edge of the eye imprint circle, was Marcus Haywood. Or something wearing his shape. He stood unnaturally still, head tilted at that impossible angle, empty eye sockets somehow fixed on the building. Behind him, more figures emerged from the darkness, each one a resident of Oak Ridge who had gone missing over the past weeks, each one eyeless, each one surrounded by glowing imprints that moved with them like loyal pets. Oh God, Patricia whispered. That's my sister Julia. She left town 3 weeks ago, said she was going to visit her daughter in Milwaukee. The figures began a slow, synchronized movement around the building, not quite walking, more like gliding over the snow, leaving no footprints behind. As they moved, the eye imprints in the snow blinked in sequence, creating a rippling effect of light that circled the community center. Inside, Jacob Wheeler began to convulse, his body arching unnaturally. The men who had brought him in backed away as frost began forming around him, spreading across the table and onto the floor. Everyone move away from the windows, Elizabeth commanded, her sheriff's voice cutting through the rising panic. And stay clear of Jacob. But it was too late. The eye imprints outside had reached the walls of the building, their glow intensifying as they began to press against the concrete foundation. Thin tendrils of frost crept up the walls, forming more eye patterns that spread across the ceiling. Jacob's convulsions stopped abruptly. He sat up, movements jerky and uncoordinated, head swiveling until his face, now featuring the same empty sockets as the figures outside, turned toward the crowd. His mouth opened in a silent scream, releasing more of the crystalline cloud that began expanding, reaching toward the closest people. Panic erupted. People rushed toward the exits, only to find the doors sealed with thick ice that had formed in seconds. I pushed through the crowd toward Jacob, grabbing a fire extinguisher from the wall as I went. Not as a weapon, but as the only source of pressure I could think of to disperse the crystalline cloud. As I discharged the extinguisher, the white chemical spray collided with Jacob's emanation, creating a bizarre reaction. The two substances swirled together, forming a miniature storm that momentarily obscured Jacob's form. When it cleared, Jacob was gone. In his place was a perfect imprint in the frosted table surface, an enormous eye, pupil dilated and staring upward. The building shuddered, eyes cracking along the walls as more eye imprints formed inside, blinking in the same synchronized pattern as those outside. From somewhere beneath us came a low, grinding sound, like massive gears turning or ancient ice shifting after centuries of stillness. "They're coming through the floor," Frank shouted, pointing to the center of the room where the polished wood was bulging upward, eye patterns forming in the warping surface. Elizabeth fired her gun into the rising floor section, the shots echoing deafeningly in the enclosed space. The bullets punched through but seemed to have no effect on whatever was pushing up from below. The floor split open with a thunderous crack, revealing not the expected crawl space or basement, but a swirling vortex of snow and ice, within which countless eyes blinked and stared, some human, some decidedly not. And rising from this impossible abyss was a figure composed entirely of those eyes, its form constantly shifting and reforming as it pulled itself into our world. "Everyone to the kitchen," I shouted, remembering the heavy metal door that separated the serving area from the main room. "Now!" As people stampeded toward the relative safety of the kitchen area, I caught a glimpse of the figures outside pressing their eyeless faces against the windows, frost spreading from the points of contact to form more watching, blinking patterns. They had found us. They had been watching all along. And now, they were coming in. The kitchen door slammed shut behind the last of us, Elizabeth and I bracing against it as something heavy collided with the other side. The metal surface instantly frosted over, ice crystals forming in intricate eye patterns that seemed to stare accusingly at our hands. "Back away from the door," I warned, pulling Elizabeth with me as the handle began to twist on its own, ice cracking as it moved. 37 people had made it to the kitchen, less than half the town's population. The rest were either still out there in the community center's main room and never made it to the meeting, or were already something else. Something watching. Patricia took charge immediately, directing people to gather anything that could be used as a weapon or barrier. The kitchen was industrial-sized, designed to serve the entire town during celebrations and emergencies. Ironic that it now served as our last refuge against something none of us understood. "The walk-in freezer," Elizabeth said suddenly. "It's insulated, sealed, and freezing cold," I finished her thought. Exactly what those things seem to thrive in. A young man, Kevin Mercer, the high school science teacher, spoke up from where he was examining the frost patterns on one of the windows. "Actually, these formations suggest they're not generating cold," he said, his academic detachment a strange contrast to the terror surrounding us. "They're absorbing it, using it. The temperature drops because they're feeding on thermal energy. So somewhere warm would slow them down?" Patricia asked, hope flickering in her voice. Kevin nodded hesitantly. "In theory. But we need significant heat, more than these kitchen appliances can generate." My mind raced through possibilities. The community center's boiler room was in the basement, unreachable now. The kitchen had gas ovens, but not enough to heat the entire space quickly. The door shuttered again, ice spreading further across its surface. Through the small window in its center, I could see the main room was now completely transformed, walls, ceiling, and floor covered in blinking eye imprints, all pulsing in that same synchronized pattern. And moving among them were the figures, no longer just the missing townspeople, but new forms being born from the eye-covered surfaces, pulling themselves free like butterflies emerging from crystalline cocoons. "The delivery truck," Frank said suddenly, his voice cracking. "In the loading dock. If it still has fuel." Elizabeth caught on immediately. "We could use it to get out of here. The evacuation buses won't make it in time." It was a desperate plan, but the only one we had. The loading dock connected directly to the kitchen via a short corridor, a straight shot to potential escape. "Check for keys," Elizabeth ordered, moving toward the corridor entrance. "And gather anything flammable. If Kevin's right about them absorbing cold, maybe fire will give us an edge." People moved with desperate purpose, collecting cooking oil, alcohol from the first aid kit, aerosol cans that might serve as makeshift flamethrowers. Kevin and 2 others rushed to the loading dock to check the truck, returning moments later with mixed news. "Truck's there and in working condition," Kevin reported. "But no keys that we could find." "I can hotwire it," offered Lily Harper, a quiet woman in her 50s who had never mentioned such skills before. When we stared at her, she shrugged. Misspent youth. A new sound drew our attention, a rhythmic tapping coming from all directions at once. Through the frosted windows, we could see the eye imprints blinking in perfect sequence, creating a percussive effect that seemed to be counting down. "We need to move now," I urged, gathering the makeshift weapons people had assembled. "Whatever's happening is accelerating." Elizabeth organized us into groups. Lily and 4 others would make for the truck first, with Frank guiding them as he knew the loading dock best. The rest would follow in waves, with the strongest in the final group to hold back whatever came through that kitchen door. I found myself in the last group with Elizabeth, Patricia, and Kevin. We distributed the flammable materials, creating crude torches from kitchen utensils wrapped in oil-soaked towels. "Ready?" Elizabeth asked, surveying our desperate preparations. Before anyone could answer, a blast of Arctic air filled the kitchen as one of the windows shattered. Through it poured not wind, but something like liquid frost, flowing across the floor with purpose, forming eyes as it spread. "Go! First group, go!" Elizabeth shouted, igniting her makeshift torch and sweeping it toward the advancing frost. Where the flame touched, the eye imprints recoiled, blinking rapidly in what almost seemed like pain. Frank led the first group toward the loading dock corridor, moving surprisingly quickly for his age. They had almost reached it when the kitchen door finally gave way, the metal tearing open like tissue paper in the grip of something immensely strong. What entered wasn't a figure, not exactly. It was as if the air itself had taken form, visible only by the swirling ice crystals and eye imprints that defined its edges. Within this amorphous shape, I could make out fragments of faces, Marcus's profile, Jacob's mouth, others I recognized from town, all jumbled together in a collage of frozen parts. Kevin's torch went out as the temperature plummeted. Patricia's followed, the flame smothered by the intense cold radiating from the entity. Only Elizabeth's and mine remained lit, flickering weakly. "Go!" Elizabeth ordered the second group, who broke for the corridor, several of them slipping on the rapidly icing floor. The entity extended a limb, not arm-shaped, but a tendril of swirling frost that reached for the fleeing townspeople. Where it touched, it left behind perfect eye imprints on clothing, skin, hair, anywhere it made contact. One man, Harold from the post office, screamed as the ice formed across his back, sinking through his coat into the skin beneath. He fell, his body convulsing as more ice sprouted across his visible skin, all blinking in that same synchronized pattern. Elizabeth fired at the entity, emptying her gun into its amorphous form. The bullets passed through, disturbing the swirling pattern momentarily before it reformed, unharmed. My torch was our last defense, its flame now barely more than a candle's worth of heat. I swept it in wide arcs, keeping the entity at bay while the second group escaped into the corridor. "Last group, go now!" I shouted, backing slowly toward the corridor entrance. "Elizabeth, Patricia, Kevin, move." They didn't need to be told twice. As Kevin and Patricia fled, Elizabeth paused at the corridor entrance, drawing her taser as a last resort. "Thomas, come on." I continued backing away, torch extended. The entity had stopped advancing, seeming almost curious now. The eye imprints across its form all fixed on me, blinking out of sync for the first time, each one examining me individually. Then, impossibly, it spoke, not with one voice but with dozens layered atop each other, some I recognized, some alien and grating. "We see you," it said, the words formed by the movement of frost crystals in the air. "We have always seen you. Every winter. Watching. Waiting. What are you?" I demanded, the torch trembling in my hand. "Witnesses," came the reply, as the entity began to coalesce into a more defined shape, humanoid but wrong, proportions fluid and changing. The watchers in the cold places. The eyes between worlds. It extended a limb toward me, not threatening now but offering, like a handshake or greeting. Show us what you see, Thomas Lowry. Add your eyes to ours. My name in that chorus of voices sent ice through my veins that had nothing to do with the temperature. How did it know me? Had it been watching all these years as I treated the townspeople, as I walked these streets, as I slept in my empty house? The thought broke whatever spell had momentarily held me in place. I hurled the torch directly at the center of the entity and ran for the corridor, not looking back as a high-pitched keening filled the air behind me. Elizabeth grabbed me as I reached her, pulling me into the corridor and slamming the fire door shut. Through its small window, I caught a glimpse of the entity engulfed not in flames, but in reverse, the fire freezing solid, crystallizing into thousands of tiny eye imprints that continued to burn with cold light. Move! Elizabeth shouted, pushing me ahead of her as we ran toward the loading dock. The corridor was already lined with eye imprints, forming on the walls and ceiling as we passed, watching our desperate flight. Behind us, the fire door crumpled inward as if crushed by an immense pressure. We burst into the loading dock to find the delivery truck's engine running, Lily in the driver's seat while others piled into the back. Frank stood by the open bay door, frantically waving us toward the vehicle. "Hurry!" he called. "It's coming from outside too." He was right. Beyond the loading dock, the parking lot was a sea of glowing eye imprints, all pulsing with that eerie light. Among them moved the eyeless figures, dozens now, some I recognized, others strangers, all advancing toward our escape route with methodical purpose. Elizabeth and I sprinted for the truck, leaping into the already crowded cargo area. Frank followed, closing the door behind him just as the first of the eyeless figures reached the loading dock. "Go!" Elizabeth shouted to Lily, who slammed the accelerator. The truck lurched forward, tires spinning on the icy surface before finding purchase. We burst through the advancing line of figures, the impact sending several of them flying, their bodies breaking apart not into blood and bone, but into swirling clouds of ice crystals that quickly reformed into more eye imprints on the ground. I pressed my face to the small rear window, watching as the community center receded behind us. The entire building was now covered in those glowing eyes, all blinking in unison, pulsing stronger with each flash. The eyeless figures stood motionless, their faces turned toward our fleeing vehicle. Then, as one, they tilted their heads back, mouths opening to release clouds of crystalline particles that merged together, forming a massive, swirling vortex above the community center. Within the storm, larger eyes began to form, not imprints now but three-dimensional structures of ice, rotating and focusing on our truck. "Drive faster," I urged Lily, who already had the accelerator pressed to the floor. "The road's pure ice," she called back. "Any faster and we'll spin out." The truck fishtailed as if to emphasize her point, the back end sliding before she regained control. Through the windows, I could see the outskirts of Oak Ridge passing by, every house dark, every yard covered in those watching imprints. "Where are we going?" someone asked, Jennifer Brooks, the elementary school teacher. "Away," Elizabeth answered simply. "As far as this truck will take us." But as we approached the town limits, marked by a weathered "Thank you for visiting Oak Ridge" sign, the road ahead began to change. The asphalt itself seemed to bubble and ripple, eye imprints forming directly in the solid surface. "Stop!" Frank shouted suddenly. "Look there!" He pointed ahead to where the road disappeared into darkness beyond our headlights. As Lily slowed the truck, we all strained to see what had alarmed Frank. The road beyond the town sign simply ended, not blocked, not damaged, but terminated in a sheer wall of swirling snow and ice that stretched as far as our lights could penetrate in either direction. Within the wall, countless eyes blinked and watched, some the size of dinner plates, others as small as pinheads. "Turn around," Patricia suggested, panic edging her voice. "Try another road out." Lily executed a careful three-point turn on the icy surface, the truck's headlights now illuminating the town we were trying to escape. In the distance, the community center glowed with unnatural light, the storm above it growing, spreading outward like an opening eye. We tried the eastern road out of town, then the southern, and finally the old logging road to the northwest. Each time we found the same barrier, a wall of watching eyes that had no business existing in our reality. "They've sealed us in," Kevin observed, his scientific detachment finally cracking. "The entire town is quarantined." "We're trapped," I added grimly. "Like specimens in a jar." We regrouped at the gas station on the edge of town, its bright fluorescent lighting and heat a temporary sanctuary. The truck's fuel gauge hovered just above empty. We wouldn't be making any more escape attempts tonight. "We need a plan," Elizabeth said, addressing our diminished group. Of the 37 who had escaped the community center, only 28 remained. The others had shown signs of the eye infection, pupils transforming, skin frosting over, and had been left behind at their own insistence, not wanting to endanger the rest. "What about the old mine tunnels?" Frank suggested. "They run deep under the mountain, might go beyond whatever boundary they've set up." The Oak Ridge silver mine had been closed for decades, its entrances officially sealed after a collapse in the 80s killed 11 miners. But locals knew that several access points remained if you knew where to look. "It's better than waiting here to freeze or worse," Elizabeth agreed. "But we'll need supplies, proper clothing." Patricia organized a scavenging party to gather essentials from the gas station and nearby stores. Kevin and I took stock of our group, checking each person for any signs of the eye infection, however small. "What do you think they want?" Kevin asked as we examined Jennifer Brooks's eyes, finding them reassuringly normal. "To see," I answered, the entity's words still echoing in my mind. "Add your eyes to ours," it said. "I think they're collectors, in a way. Gathering perspectives, viewpoints, ways of seeing the world. But why here? Why now?" I had been pondering the same question. Frank mentioned his grandmother's stories, eyes in the frost that watched for sinners. What if these entities have always been here, just dormant, watching through the winters, century after century? And something woke them up, Kevin concluded. But what? Before I could speculate further, a commotion erupted at the front of the store. One of our group, Robert Lane, the bank manager, was pressed against the glass doors, pointing outside with a trembling finger. "They're coming," he gasped. "All of them." Through the large windows of the gas station, we could see them, every missing resident of Oak Ridge, walking in perfect synchronization down the main street. Leading them was the amorphous entity from the community center, now fully formed into a towering figure composed entirely of interlocking, blinking eyes. Behind this procession, the community center collapsed in on itself, the structure dissolving into a swirling vortex of ice and snow that rose skyward, forming a vast, curved surface, like the interior of a massive eyeball, with the storm center as its pupil. "They're remaking the town," Frank whispered in horror. "Changing it into something else." As we watched, other buildings began the same transformation, the town hall, the elementary school, the church, all collapsing and reforming into curved, organic structures that reflected the eerie light of the eye imprints covering every surface. "The mine," Elizabeth decided, her voice snapping with authority. "We leave now, before they reach us." We grabbed what supplies we could carry and headed for the gas station's rear exit. Outside, the cold hit us like a physical blow, stealing breath and fogging glasses. But worse than the cold was the sensation of being observed from every direction. The snow at our feet, the ice on the trees, even the frozen air itself seemed to watch our every move. The mine entrance Frank led us to was hidden behind the old processing plant, a rusted metal door set into the hillside, partially concealed by overgrown bushes now laden with ice. Hasn't been opened in years, Frank grunted as he and two others worked to clear the entrance. Used to play down here as kids. Against the rules, of course. The door finally yielded with a screech of protesting metal. Beyond it, a dark tunnel stretched into the mountain, the stale air carrying the scent of damp earth and old timbers. Everyone inside, Elizabeth ordered, ushering the group through the narrow opening. Quickly now! I paused at the entrance, looking back toward town. The procession of eyeless figures had reached the gas station, surrounding it completely. At their center, the eye-composed entity had grown even larger, towering over the single-story buildings around it. As I watched, it turned, slowly, deliberately, until its gaze fixed directly on our position. Impossible at this distance, and yet I felt the weight of that attention like a physical pressure against my skin. "Thomas," Elizabeth called from inside the tunnel. "Come on." I ducked into the darkness, helping Frank pull the door closed behind us. The sound of its closing echoed through the tunnel like a final judgment. We were sealed in the earth, fleeing from things that owned the sky and snow. From watchers that had perhaps always been there, in the coldest depths of winter, in the corners of our vision, in the patterns of frost on our windows. Watching. Waiting. And finally, after countless winters, ready to be seen in return. Do you feel them watching, even now? The mine tunnel stretched before us like the veins of some enormous beast, branching and narrowing as we ventured deeper into the mountain. Our flashlights cast weak halos against the rock walls, the beams seeming to be absorbed rather than reflected by the glistening surfaces. Frank led the way, his knowledge of the tunnels proving invaluable as we navigated the labyrinth. Elizabeth brought up the rear, ensuring no one fell behind or that nothing followed us from the world above. "These support timbers aren't looking too good," Kevin observed, pointing his light at the ceiling where ancient wooden beams sagged under the weight of the mountain. "This whole section could come down." "That's reassuring," Jennifer muttered, clutching the hand of a young boy, Ethan Miller, whose parents had been among those transformed at the community center. I checked my watch. We had been underground for nearly 3 hours, moving steadily downward and, we hoped, beyond the boundary of whatever had enclosed Oak Ridge. The cold had followed us, the temperature dropping the deeper we went, our breath forming clouds that lingered too long in the stagnant air. "There should be a larger chamber ahead," Frank said, his voice echoing softly. "Old break room for the miners. We can rest there, figure out our next move." The chamber, when we reached it, was indeed larger, a rough-hewn space perhaps 30 feet across, with several tunnel entrances branching off in different directions. Ancient tables and chairs, now rotted and collapsed, littered the floor alongside rusted equipment and mildew papers. Patricia organized our supplies as people settled onto relatively clean patches of ground. Our food would last 3 days if carefully rationed, the water perhaps 2. The flashlights and lanterns were another matter. Already their beams seemed dimmer, batteries draining faster than they should in the cold. "We need to keep moving," Elizabeth said, joining me at the chamber's edge where I was examining a faded map of the mine posted on the wall. "If these tunnels go as deep as Frank says, there's a chance they connect to the next valley over. If they're not collapsed," I added, tracing a line on the brittle paper. "Some of these passages haven't been maintained in 50 years. Elizabeth sighed, removing her sheriff's hat and running a hand through her short gray hair. Got better idea? Because I'm fresh out. I had no answer. My medical training had prepared me for many emergencies, but an invasion of eye-creating entities from beyond our understanding wasn't covered in any textbook I'd studied. A soft sound drew our attention, a rhythmic tapping from one of the branching tunnels. At first, I thought it might be water dripping from the ceiling, but the pattern was too regular, too deliberate. Tap, 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 tap. Then silence. Did you hear that? I whispered to Elizabeth, who nodded, hand moving to her empty holster by reflex. We listened intently, but the sound didn't repeat. After a moment, Elizabeth shook her head. Probably just settling rock. This whole place is unstable. But something about the rhythm nagged at me, familiar somehow, like a half-remembered code or signal. I returned to the group, checking on those who seemed most affected by our ordeal. Ethan Miller sat quietly beside Jennifer, his small face pale but composed. When I knelt to examine him, he looked up with eyes that were mercifully normal. "Are the Ice Eyes going to find us down here?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "No," I assured him with more confidence than I felt. "They can't see through all this rock." "But they're everywhere," he insisted. "Mom said they were in the snow and the ice in the air. She said they were even in her dreams before they took her." His words sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Your mom said that? Before today?" Ethan nodded solemnly. "She started seeing them last week. In the frost on the windows first, then everywhere. Dad said she was just tired, but..." His voice trailed off, eyes downcast. I placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, mind racing with implications. If Ethan's mother had seen the eye imprints days before they manifested physically, what did that mean? Were the entities somehow preparing the town, infiltrating dreams and perceptions before their arrival? The tapping came again, louder this time, and from a different tunnel. Everyone froze, conversation dying instantly as we all strained to hear. Tap, 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 tap. "There's someone else down here," Patricia whispered, clutching her makeshift weapon, a length of rusty pipe. "Or something," Kevin added grimly. Elizabeth signaled for silence, directing several people to douse their lights. In the diminished illumination, shadows stretched and distorted across the chamber walls, making it impossible to tell which tunnel the sound had come from. We waited, barely breathing. Minutes stretched like hours in the oppressive darkness. Then, from yet another tunnel, the one we had originally planned to take, came the sound again. Not tapping this time, but a slow, deliberate scraping, like nails being drawn across stone. "Surround the children," Elizabeth ordered quietly. Everyone back to back, lights facing outward. We formed a defensive circle in the center of the chamber, the weakest in the middle, those with weapons or lights forming a perimeter. I found myself shoulder to shoulder with Frank, whose weathered face showed not fear but grim resignation. "This is how my grandmother said it happens," he murmured. "First they watch. Then they come." "What comes, Frank?" I pressed, desperate for any information that might help us. "The collectors," he replied, eyes fixed on the dark tunnel entrance before us. "The ones who harvest eyes for the watching place." Before I could question him further, a figure appeared at the mouth of the tunnel, not entering, just standing motionless at the threshold of darkness and light. It took me a moment to recognize Marcus Haywood's distinctive build, though his face remained shadowed. "Marcus?" Patricia called tentatively. "Is that you?" The figure tilted its head at an unnatural angle but remained silent. Then, slowly, it stepped into the dim light cast by our circle of flashlights. It was Marcus's body, unmistakably, the same clothes he had worn that morning, the same posture and build. But his face, where his eyes should have been, were now smooth, featureless depressions, as if the skin had grown over empty sockets. And from these depressions emanated a pale blue glow, the same light we had seen in the eye imprints above ground. "We see you," said Marcus's mouth, but the voice was the same layered chorus we had heard at the community center. "Even here, even in darkness, we have always seen you." More figures appeared behind him: Jacob Wheeler, Ethan's mother Lisa Miller, others I recognized and many I didn't. All with the same eyeless faces, all glowing with that internal blue light. "What do you want?" Elizabeth demanded, her voice steady despite everything. "To witness," Marcus replied, his head rotating further than humanly possible. "To collect. To preserve. Your world is but one of many we observe." "Why now?" I asked, remembering Kevin's earlier question. "Why after all this time?" The chorus of voices emanating from Marcus seemed to change tone, becoming almost contemplative. "The walls thin. The cold deepens. The forgotten cycles return." The eyeless face turned toward me specifically. "You have sensed it too, Thomas Lowry. In your dreams. In the corners of your vision. We have been watching you for many winters." A chill ran down my spine at the entity's words. I had experienced strange dreams lately, visions of endless white landscapes dotted with blinking lights, sensations of falling through cold so intense it burned. "The cycle completes," Marcus continued, taking another step forward as the other eyeless figures fanned out around the chamber, emerging from every tunnel entrance. "This place becomes part of the watching place. Its people become witnesses. As it was before. As it will be again." "Before?" Frank echoed. "You've been here before?" "This valley has opened to us many times," the entity confirmed through Marcus's mouth. "The last was 300 winters past, when the people fled and the settlement was reclaimed. You remember, old one. Your blood remembers." Frank gasped softly beside me. "My grandmother's stories, they weren't superstitions. They were warnings. History." The realization hit me with stunning clarity. Oak Ridge wasn't the first settlement in this valley to encounter these entities. There had been another, centuries ago, likely wiped from official record but preserved in folk tales and family histories like Frank's. "We give you choice," Marcus announced, his eyeless face scanning our huddled group. "Join the witnesses willingly. See as we see. Or remain in darkness, forgotten and blind." "And if we refuse?" Elizabeth challenged. "Then you will wait," the entity replied simply. "In these tunnels. Until the cold finds you. Until the hunger weakens you. Until you beg to be seen." As if to emphasize this point, a low rumbling shook the chamber, dust and small stones raining from the ceiling. One of the tunnel entrances collapsed entirely, sealed by falling rock. "Your paths diminish," Marcus observed. "Your time shortens. Choose." A terrible silence fell over our group as the implications became clear. We were being offered transformation or slow death trapped underground. Neither option promised survival as we understood it. Ethan's small voice broke the silence. "I want my mom." The eyeless figure of Lisa Miller turned toward her son, head tilting in that unsettling manner. She extended a hand, frost forming around her fingers in intricate eye patterns. Come, she said, her voice alone among the chorus. See through my eyes now. See everything. Jennifer tightened her grip on Ethan's hand, pulling him closer. Don't listen. That's not your mother anymore. But something had changed in Ethan's expression, a recognition, perhaps, or resignation. She's still in there, he said quietly. I can feel her. Before anyone could stop him, he broke from our circle, running toward his mother's outstretched hand. Elizabeth lunged to intercept him but was too slow. The moment Ethan's fingers touched his mother's, frost spread from the point of contact up his arm, tiny imprints forming on his skin, blinking rapidly as they multiplied. I see, he whispered, his voice filled with wonder rather than fear. I see everything. All the winters. All the worlds. All the eyes watching, always watching. His own eyes began to change, pupils reshaping into those hexagonal patterns I had observed in Jacob before. But unlike Jacob's horrific transformation, Ethan seemed peaceful, almost transcendent. It doesn't hurt, he called back to us, his voice both his own and somehow more. It's beautiful. Like becoming part of something bigger. The eyeless figures moved closer, encircling our diminished group. The temperature plummeted further, ice forming on the chamber walls in fractal patterns of countless watching eyes. Choose, Marcus repeated, the word echoing throughout the chamber. People began to break away from our circle, some moving toward the eyeless figures with expressions of defeat or acceptance, others backing further into the center, clutching one another in desperation. Elizabeth grabbed my arm, pulling me close to whisper in my ear. The map. Did you see another way out? I nodded slightly. There's a vertical shaft marked in the northeast corner. Might be a ventilation shaft or emergency exit. If it's not collapsed. Better than waiting to freeze, she murmured. Get Frank and Kevin. We'll make a break for it while they're distracted with the others. I felt a stab of guilt at the thought of abandoning anyone, but rationally, I knew not everyone could be saved. Some had already made their choice, walking willingly into the embrace of the eyeless ones. I caught Kevin's attention with a subtle gesture, then Frank's. Elizabeth pointed discreetly toward the northeast corner of the chamber where a small, easily overlooked opening was partially hidden behind a collapsed cart. As more of our group surrendered to the watching entities, the four of us edged toward the escape route, keeping our movements slow and deliberate to avoid drawing attention. We had almost reached the opening when Frank stumbled, his foot catching on a piece of debris. The noise was small, but in the eerie quiet of the chamber, it might as well have been a gunshot. Every eyeless face turned toward us simultaneously. The resistant ones seek escape, Marcus observed, the chorus of voices now tinged with something like amusement. There is nowhere beyond our sight, Thomas Lowry. We have seen every path you might take. The entity raised Marcus's arms, and the ceiling above our escape route collapsed in a shower of rock and dust, sealing it completely. One by one, the remaining tunnel entrances suffered the same fate, collapsing under invisible pressure until only a single path remained open, the one leading back toward town, toward the transformed Oak Ridge, toward the watching place. There is only forward now, the entity stated. Through us. With us. As us. Elizabeth's hand found mine in the semi-darkness, her grip fierce and determined. On my other side, Frank and Kevin stood resolute, faces illuminated by the pale blue glow emanating from the eyeless ones. What happens to us? I asked, my voice echoing in the now silent chamber. If we join you, do we disappear? Do our minds survive? You become witnesses, the entity replied through Marcus's mouth. Your perspective joins the many. Your eyes become part of the endless watching. Nothing is lost. Everything is seen. And what purpose does this watching serve? Kevin demanded, the scientist in him still seeking understanding even at the end. The eyeless ones seemed to consider this, their heads tilting in that synchronized way that made my skin crawl. Purpose? Marcus finally said. What purpose does any observation serve? To know. To record. To remember when all else is forgotten. A strange calm settled over me then, a clarity born perhaps of exhaustion or acceptance. These entities weren't malevolent in any human sense, they were something utterly alien, collectors of perspective, archivists of vision. They didn't hate us or wish us suffering, they simply wanted to add our ways of seeing to their vast repository. If I join you, I said carefully, do I get to choose what I see? The question seemed to intrigue the entity. Marcus's eyeless face turned fully toward me. All witnesses see all things, in time, it answered. But preferences may persist. Focal points remain. What would you choose to watch, Thomas Lowry? I thought of my years in Oak Ridge, of the people I had treated, the lives I had touched. I thought of spring mornings after the snow melted, of children playing in summer fields, of autumn leaves falling in gentle spirals. I would watch for signs of hope, I said finally. For moments of kindness. For beauty in forgotten places. A sound like distant wind passed through the chamber, the collective response of the eyeless ones, perhaps amusement or approval. Then watch you shall, Marcus said, extending his hand toward me. Add your eyes to ours. See what we see. Show us what you see. Elizabeth's grip on my hand tightened, her voice barely audible. Thomas, don't. I looked at her, this strong, brave woman who had protected our town for decades. At Frank, keeper of warnings we had all forgotten. At Kevin, whose curiosity had never dimmed even in the face of the impossible. We don't have a choice, I said gently. But perhaps we can influence what these entities become by joining them. Perhaps our perspectives matter. I stepped forward, releasing Elizabeth's hand. The cold intensified around me as I approached Marcus and the entity speaking through him. Frost formed on my clothing, tiny-eyed patterns taking shape, watching my final human moments. I see you, Thomas Lowry, the entity said as I reached for its outstretched hand. I have always seen you. Our fingers touched, and the world exploded into countless perspectives at once. I was seeing through every eye imprint at Oak Ridge simultaneously, witnessing the transformation of the town from thousands of angles. I saw the massive eye-like structure that had once been the community center, now the pupil of an enormous watching organ that covered the entire valley. And beyond our valley, I saw other places, countless realms of ice and snow where similar transformations had occurred or were occurring. An infinite network of watching places, all connected, all observing reality through harvested perspectives. The cold that had been external now filled me, but it no longer hurt. It felt clarifying, expansive. My awareness stretched beyond my dissolving body, becoming part of something vast and ancient and patient. Behind me, I sensed rather than saw Elizabeth, Frank, and Kevin making their choice, joining the witnesses rather than facing slow death alone in the darkness. Their perspectives merged with mine, their memories and ways of seeing becoming threads in an immense tapestry of observation. As my human form faded, replaced by patterns of watching eyes, I focused on what I had promised, the moments of hope, the acts of kindness, the forgotten beauty. I reached across the network of witnesses, finding those memories, highlighting them, amplifying them. And I realized then what we had become part of, not destroyers, but preservers. When the world above changed beyond recognition, when humanity evolved or perished or transformed, these memories would remain, witnessed for eternity by the eyes in the frost. Seasons would pass, civilizations would rise and fall, but the watching would continue. And somewhere in that endless observation, my perspective, Thomas Lowry's way of seeing, would remain. Watching, witnessing, remembering, waiting for the next winter when the walls between worlds thinned, when new eyes would be added to the ever-watching many. Can you feel them now, in the frost on your window, in the patterns of ice on frozen ponds, in the snow that falls silently in the deepest hours of winter night? They are there, watching, always watching. And somewhere among them, I am watching too. Have you ever had that feeling of being watched when you're completely alone? That sensation of eyes drilling into your back from somewhere just beyond your vision? The GPS had stopped working about 20 minutes ago, right around the time the paved road gave way to gravel and then to dirt. My name is Daniel Hayes, and I've made this drive dozens of times before, a weekend trip to visit my sister Elaine in Millbrook, a straight shot through the mountains that should take 3 hours, maybe 3.5 if traffic was bad near Burlington. But today, something was different. I reached for my phone again, tapping at the screen in frustration. No signal. Not even a single bar. The radio had been playing static for the last half hour, and now my playlist had disappeared as well, leaving me in silence broken only by the crunch of tires on the unfamiliar road. This isn't right, I muttered, slowing the car as the trees grew denser on either side. Tall pines crowded the narrow path, their branches creating a canopy that dimmed the afternoon sun to a murky twilight. I didn't remember this part of the journey. Not once in 5 years of making this trip had I seen this particular stretch of road. The first drops of rain hit my windshield, and I switched on the wipers. The forest seemed to lean in closer, as if curious about the intruder in their midst. A thin mist was forming between the trees, curling around their trunks like spectral fingers. I should turn around. That was the logical thing to do. But something pulled me forward, curiosity, perhaps, or that strange magnetic quality that unknown paths sometimes possess. Just a little further, I told myself. Just to see where it leads. The trees abruptly fell away, and I found myself at the edge of a valley. Below me, nestled between rolling hills and a river that gleamed silver in the fading light, was a town. Not a small cluster of buildings that might constitute a village, but a proper town, with church spires and what looked like a town square, streets radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel. That's impossible, I whispered, pulling over to the shoulder of the road. I had studied maps of this region extensively for a geology paper in college. There was no town in these mountains. Nothing of this size, anyway. I reached for my phone again, half expecting it to still show no signal, but to my surprise, it had sprung back to life. The map application was open, a blue dot pulsing at my location. But where the town clearly stood below me, the map showed nothing but forest and mountain terrain. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof of my car. The logical part of my brain told me to turn around, to find my way back to the main highway. But the other part, the part that had always been drawn to mysteries and puzzles, urged me forward. A town that didn't exist on any map? That was worth investigating, if only to prove to myself I wasn't hallucinating. I put the car back in drive and began the descent into the valley. The road wound its way down in sharp switchbacks, each turn revealing more of the town below. Something about the architecture seemed off, not quite modern, but not exactly historic either. a peculiar mixture of styles that shouldn't coexist but somehow did. As I approached the town limits, I noticed the first sign that something was truly wrong. There were no cars on the streets. Not a single one. No people walking along the sidewalks either, despite it being only late afternoon. The rain had eased to a gentle patter, hardly enough to drive everyone indoors. A wooden sign stood at the edge of town, its paint peeling and faded. "Welcome to Imberwick," it read. Population, the number had been scratched out, replaced with what looked like tally marks that had also been partially erased. I slowed the car to a crawl as I passed the sign, a shiver running down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. The streets were cobblestone, slick with rain, reflecting the gray sky above. Victorian lampposts lined the sidewalks, unlit despite the growing darkness. Something caught my eye, a flutter of movement in an upstairs window of a building that might have once been a hotel. A curtain falling back into place, perhaps. Or just my imagination. I parked in front of what appeared to be a small cafe, its windows dark but intact. The engine died with an abruptness that startled me, as if it had been waiting for the opportunity to quit. In the sudden silence, I could hear the rain, the creak of a sign swinging in the breeze, and something else, a low, constant hum, just at the edge of hearing. "Hello?" I called out as I stepped from the car, my voice sounding flat and muffled in the damp air. No response, not even an echo. The town seemed to absorb sound rather than reflect it. The sign above the cafe read "The Timeless Cup." Its door was unlocked, swinging open at my touch with a protesting groan. The interior was dim but not dark, enough light filtered through the windows to reveal tables and chairs in perfect order, as if set up for customers expected at any moment. No dust covered the surfaces, no sign of abandonment or decay. A newspaper lay on the counter by the cash register. I picked it up, my fingers leaving smudges on the pristine paper. The date at the top read October 23rd, 1978, nearly 50 years ago. The headline caught my breath in my throat: "Search continues for missing hikers." Below it was a photograph of 6 people, smiling at the camera, standing in front of a familiar mountain range. I recognized one of the faces immediately. It was older, with fewer lines and darker hair, but unmistakably the face of my geology professor from college, Dr. Harrison. The same professor who had always warned us never to stray from marked paths in these mountains. The bell above the door jingled, and I spun around, heart leaping into my throat. But there was no one there, just the door swinging gently on its hinges, pushed by a draft I couldn't feel. And then I heard it. Footsteps on the cobblestones outside. Not the random patter of rain, but deliberate, measured steps. Coming closer. I moved to the window, peering out into the street that was now shrouded in a thickening mist. A figure was emerging from the fog, tall and unnaturally thin, walking with a gait that seemed just slightly wrong, as if its joints bent in directions they shouldn't. It paused directly across from the cafe, and though I couldn't make out a face in the mist, I knew with absolute certainty that it was looking directly at me. A voice whispered from somewhere behind me, inside the cafe, "You shouldn't have come here." I whirled around, but the cafe was empty. When I turned back to the window, the figure in the street was gone. But the footsteps continued, now moving around to the side of the building, toward the cafe's back entrance. My heart hammering in my chest, I reached for the door, desperate to get back to my car. My fingers closed around the handle just as the lights in the cafe suddenly flickered on, revealing reflections in the window glass that couldn't possibly be there. Dozens of faces pressed against the glass from outside, their features blurred and distorted, their eyes dark pools of shadow. I yanked open the door and ran for my car, fumbling with the keys as the mist swirled around my ankles like living tendrils, trying to hold me in place. The engine sputtered once, twice, before roaring to life. As I pulled away from the curb, my headlights swept across the front of the cafe. For just a moment, I could see inside clearly, and the cafe was full of people, all turned to stare at me, their faces identical masks of sorrow and mourning. I accelerated down the empty street, searching desperately for the road that had brought me into this impossible town. In my rearview mirror, I could see figures emerging from doorways and alleys, moving with that same wrong gait, flowing together like tributaries into a river, following my car at an unhurried pace. They didn't need to rush. Somehow, I knew with terrible certainty that Emberwick wouldn't let me leave so easily. Not now that it had found me. The road ahead forked, made their path familiar. I hesitated, then chose the left branch, praying it would lead me back up the mountain, away from this place that shouldn't exist. But as the mist closed in, reducing visibility to mere feet, I felt the car begin to slow despite my foot pressing harder on the accelerator. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died, leaving me stranded in a sea of white. And through the mist, I heard those measured footsteps approaching once more. What would you do if the world you knew suddenly stopped making sense? If the rules that govern reality bent and twisted before your eyes? I sat in my dead car for what felt like hours, watching the mist press against the windows like a living thing, hearing those footsteps circle around me, never quite approaching, never fully retreating. My phone was useless now, the screen frozen on the map that showed nothing but wilderness where I clearly sat in a town. When the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the fog, I finally gathered enough courage to leave the car. The street was empty. No sign of the figures that had pursued me. No indication anyone had ever been there at all. Emberwick looked different in the morning light, less menacing, perhaps, but somehow more wrong. Colors seemed slightly off, as if the entire town existed just a few degrees removed from normal reality. Buildings that had appeared Victorian in the twilight now showed elements of Gothic architecture mixed with distinctly modern features. Impossible combinations that the eye refused to properly process. My stomach growled, reminding me I hadn't eaten since yesterday afternoon. I needed food, information, and ideally gas for my car if I was going to find my way out of here. The Timeless Cup was just visible down the street, and despite my experience there the previous evening, it seemed the most logical place to start. As I walked, I became aware of a subtle distortion in the air around me. Sound didn't travel quite right. My footsteps sometimes reached my ears a fraction of a second after my foot hit the cobblestone, or just before. And occasionally, when I passed certain buildings, I could hear fragments of conversations that couldn't possibly be happening. Told him not to go down to the river after. 3 more disappeared last night from the east. The clock tower hasn't been right since 1932. The voices faded in and out like badly tuned radio stations, never clear enough to determine their source. I quickened my pace, trying to ignore the sensation of being watched from every darkened window. The Timeless Cup was open this morning, warm light spilling onto the street from its windows. A bell jingled cheerfully as I pushed open the door, and the rich aroma of fresh coffee enveloped me. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 60s, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, her face lined but pleasant. "Good morning, traveler," she said, her voice carrying an accent I couldn't quite place. "You look like you could use some coffee and a hot breakfast." I hesitated in the doorway, scanning the cafe. 3 other people occupied tables, an elderly man reading a newspaper in the corner, a middle-aged woman writing in a journal by the window, and a young man who looked to be in his early 20s, staring intently at a chessboard with no opponent. Yes, thank you," I managed, approaching the counter cautiously. I'm afraid my car broke down last night. I was hoping someone might be able to help me get it started. And I seem to be a bit lost." The woman smiled, but the expression didn't reach her eyes. "You're in Imberwick, dear. As for your car, Maxwell might be able to take a look at it later. He has a way with machines." She gestured to the young man with the chessboard. "Sit anywhere you like. I'll bring you our special." I chose a table near the door, positioning myself so I could watch both the street outside and the other patrons inside. The elderly man had not turned a page of his newspaper since I'd entered. The woman by the window wrote continuously, her pen never lifting from the page. The waitress brought me a plate of eggs, bacon, and toast, along with a steaming mug of coffee. "I'm Josephine," she said, placing the food before me. "Everyone calls me Joe." "You're welcome to do the same." "Daniel," I replied. "Daniel Hayes. Thank you for this. I'm trying to get to Millbrook. My sister is expecting me." Joe's smile faltered for just a moment. "Millbrook is quite a ways from here, especially if you've wandered off the main roads. Eat your breakfast, dear. Things will seem clearer afterward." As she walked away, I noticed something odd about her movements. There was a slight delay, as if her image lagged behind her actual body by milliseconds. I blinked hard, attributing the visual distortion to exhaustion and stress. The food was delicious, surprisingly so, and I found myself ravenously hungry. As I ate, I studied my fellow patrons more carefully. None of them had acknowledged my presence. The elderly man's newspaper, I now realized, was dated June 12, 1954. The chess player, Maxwell, apparently, was moving pieces in a pattern that made no sense, placing his knight directly in the path of an attack that wasn't there. "Excuse me," I said, directing my question to the room at large. "Can anyone tell me how to get back to the main highway from here?" No one responded. Not even a glance in my direction. "They can't hear you," came a voice from beside me. I nearly jumped out of my skin. A girl of about 16 had materialized in the chair across from me. She had dark hair cut in a severe bob, pale skin, and bright green eyes that seemed too large for her face. She wore jeans and a red flannel shirt that looked straight out of the 1990s. "What do you mean? They can't hear me?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "They're not really here," she replied, tapping her fingers on the table in a complex rhythm. "Not in the same way you and I are. They're echoes." I glanced around the cafe again. Jo was wiping down the counter, her movements now seeming mechanical, repetitive. Echoes of what? Of what they were. Of what they did, day after day, until it became imprinted on this place. The girl leaned forward. "My name's Eleanor. Most people call me Elle. And you're new. You're not supposed to be here." "That much is obvious," I said, trying to keep the edge of panic from my voice. "I took a wrong turn somewhere. I'm just trying to get back to the main road." Elle laughed, the sound brittle and sharp. "It's not that simple. Imberwick doesn't appear on maps because it doesn't want to be found. It only reveals itself to those it chooses." I felt a chill run down my spine despite the warmth of the cafe. "You're saying the town chose me? That's ridiculous. Towns don't choose anything." "Normal towns don't," Elle agreed. "But Imberwick isn't normal. You must have realized that by now." Before I could respond, the door to the cafe swung open, admitting a tall, broad-shouldered man in a sheriff's uniform. His badge read Sheriff Moore. His face was handsome in a weathered way, but his eyes were cold and assessing as they swept the room and landed on me. "Morning, Joe," he called to the waitress, who responded with a nod that seemed almost robotic. "And who might you be?" he asked, approaching my table. "Daniel Hayes," I said, standing to offer my hand. "My car broke down last night. I'm trying to get to Millbrook." The sheriff ignored my outstretched hand. "There's no record of any vehicle entering town yesterday," he said flatly. "And we don't get many visitors in Emberwick." I glanced at Elle for support, but the chair across from me was empty. The girl had vanished as suddenly as she had appeared. "I came in from the north," I explained, "down the mountain road. My GPS stopped working, and I got lost. Listen, if someone could just help me get my car started." "What car would that be?" Sheriff Moore asked, his voice dangerously soft. I turned toward the window, pointing to where I'd left my sedan parked on the street. But the space was empty. My car was gone. "I don't appreciate liars, Mr. Hayes," the sheriff said, moving closer. "And Emberwick doesn't take kindly to strangers who don't belong." The temperature in the cafe seemed to drop several degrees. I noticed that Joe and the other patrons had frozen in place, like mannequins arranged in a life-size diorama. "There's been some misunderstanding," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. My car was right there. A blue sedan. I parked it there last night when the engine died. There hasn't been a working automobile in Emberwick since 1983, Sheriff Moore said, his hand moving to rest on the butt of his holstered pistol. "Not since the incident at the clock tower." My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Something was very wrong with this man, with this entire town. The wrongness I'd sensed earlier was crystallizing into something more defined, a pervasive sense that time itself wasn't functioning properly here. "I need to use your bathroom," I blurted out, desperate for a moment alone to think. The sheriff's expression didn't change, but he nodded toward a door at the back of the cafe. "Don't go wandering off, Mr. Hayes. We're not done here." I walked as calmly as I could to the bathroom, feeling the sheriff's gaze burning into my back. Once inside, I locked the door and leaned against it, breathing hard. The bathroom was small but clean, with a single window high on the wall. Too small for me to climb through, but maybe large enough to see where I was in relation to the town center. I stood on the toilet and peered out. The window didn't look out onto an alley or back street as I expected. Instead, I found myself staring into what appeared to be a school classroom from the 1950s. Children sat at desks, their heads bowed over papers, while a teacher wrote on a blackboard. As I watched, one child, a boy of about 10, slowly raised his head and turned to look directly at me. His eyes were completely black, like pools of ink. I stumbled backward, nearly falling off the toilet. A knock at the bathroom door made me jump again. "Mr. Hayes?" The sheriff's voice. "Everything all right in there?" "Fine," I called back, my voice cracking. "Just a minute." I splashed cold water on my face, trying to clear my head. When I looked up at the mirror, my reflection showed dark circles under my eyes and a pallor to my skin that hadn't been there yesterday. But more disturbing was what I saw behind me. Reflected in the mirror was not the bathroom door, but a long, dark corridor lined with doors stretching impossibly far back. I spun around, but behind me was just the normal bathroom door, solid and real. When I looked back at the mirror, the corridor was still there. Another knock, more insistent this time. "Mr. Hayes, open this door." I had no choice. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the door and pulled it open. But it wasn't the sheriff who stood there. It was Elle, her finger pressed urgently to her lips. Quickly, she whispered. He's distracted, but not for long. She grabbed my hand, and I felt an electric shock run up my arm, not painful, but intense, like static electricity magnified 100-fold. She pulled me through the cafe kitchen, past a cook who stood motionless over a sizzling pan, his spatula suspended mid-flip. We burst out a back door into an alley I hadn't noticed before. The mist had returned, curling around our ankles as Elle led me at a run through a maze of narrow passages between buildings. Where are we going? I gasped as we rounded a corner. Somewhere safe, Elle replied. Somewhere time doesn't slip as much. I wanted to ask what she meant, but at that moment we emerged from the alley onto a wider street dominated by an imposing stone building, a library, judging by the books visible through its large windows. In here, Elle urged, pulling me up the steps. Hurry! As we reached the library doors, I heard a shout from behind us. Sheriff Moore stood at the end of the street, his face contorted with rage. Stop, he bellowed, the sound distorted and stretched as if played at the wrong speed. Elle yanked open the heavy doors, and we tumbled inside. The library was vast, larger than it had appeared from outside, with towering shelves that seemed to extend upward far beyond what the building's exterior suggested was possible. He won't follow us in here, Elle said, her voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. The librarian won't let him. As if on cue, a tall, rail-thin woman appeared from between the stacks. Her gray hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her skin, giving her features a skeletal quality. She regarded us over the top of wire-rimmed glasses. Eleanor, she said, her voice surprisingly warm. You've brought a visitor. This is Daniel, Elle explained. He didn't come here on purpose. The town took him. The librarian, her name tag read Miss Blackwood, studied me intently. That's unusual. Emberwick hasn't chosen a new resident in quite some time. I'm not a resident, I protested. I'm just passing through. I need to get to Millbrook. Ms. Blackwood and Elle exchanged a significant look. Perhaps you should show him the archives, the librarian suggested. It might help him understand. Elle nodded and took my hand again, that same electric sensation tingling up my arm. This way, she said, leading me deeper into the library. As we walked, I noticed that some shelves contained regular books, while others held objects, a child's shoe, a pocket watch, a broken camera. Each item had a small tag attached to it, bearing a date and a name. What is this place? I whispered. The memory of Emberwick, Elle replied. Everything that's been lost, everything that's been forgotten, it all ends up here eventually. We descended a spiral staircase that seemed to go down much further than should have been possible, the air growing cooler with each step. At the bottom was a single door with a placard that read Archives Authorized Personnel Only. Elle produced a key from her pocket. Ms. Blackwood gave this to me when I first arrived. She said I had the right to know. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and the door swung open to reveal a circular room lined with filing cabinets. In the center stood a pedestal supporting an enormous leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. This is the record, Elle said, approaching the book with something like reverence. It contains the name of every person who has ever entered Emberwick, and whether they left or became part of it. With trembling fingers, I opened the book, its pages crackling beneath my touch. Names filled the parchment in different handwritings, some fresh and clear, others faded to near invisibility. Beside each name was either the word departed or remained. And there, on the last written page, in ink that still gleamed wet, Daniel Hayes. Beside my name, the space was blank. You see, Elle said softly, Emberwick hasn't decided what to do with you yet. I slammed the book shut, backing away from it. This is insane. All of this. I need to find my car and get out of here. Your car is gone, Elle said calmly. Just like mine was. Just like everyone's who ends up here. Emberwick takes what connects you to the outside world first. Then it starts taking memories. A chill ran through me. What are you talking about? Elle looked at me sadly. What's your sister's phone number, Daniel? The one you're supposedly going to visit. I opened my mouth to recite it and found I couldn't remember. Not just the number, but her face was becoming blurry in my mind, details of her features slipping away like water through cupped hands. What's happening to me? I whispered, panic rising in my throat. Emberwick is happening to you, Elle replied. And we don't have much time before it happens completely. A bell tolled somewhere above us, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the foundations of the building. Elle's face paled. The clock tower. It's not supposed to ring during daylight. What does that mean? I asked, though I was afraid I already knew. It means the town knows you're trying to understand it, she said, grabbing my arm. And it doesn't like that. We need to go. Now. As we rushed back up the spiral staircase, I could hear a growing commotion above, voices raised in alarm, the sound of running feet. The tolling of the bell continued, each peal seeming to bend the air around us, making the stairway twist and shift beneath our feet. Where are we going? I gasped as we emerged into the main library, where chaos had erupted. Books were flying off shelves of their own accord, pages fluttering like startled birds. Ms. Blackwood stood at the center of the storm, her arms raised as if conducting an orchestra of literary mayhem. The clock tower, Elle shouted over the din. If we can reach it, I can show you the truth about Emberwick. And maybe, just maybe, a way out. She pulled me toward a side door, and as we burst through it into the street, I saw that the mist had turned from white to a sickly yellow-green, coiling and writhing like a living entity. In the distance, rising above the town, the clock tower stood, its face showing not numerals, but strange symbols that shifted and changed even as I watched. And all around us, emerging from buildings and alleys, the residents of Emberwick were gathering. Their movements were jerky and uncoordinated, like marionettes with tangled strings. Their faces were blank, expressionless, all except for their eyes, which tracked our progress with hungry intensity. Sheriff Moore stood at their head, his badge now tarnished black, his uniform torn and stained as if he'd been wearing it for decades without changing. The town doesn't want you to reach the tower, Elle said, tugging me forward. But we have to try. It's the only way. As we ran through streets that seemed to bend and stretch with each step, the residents of Emberwick followed, not running, but moving with that strange, wrong gait that covered distance in ways that defied physics. And with each block we crossed, I felt my memories of the world outside growing dimmer, like photographs left too long in the sun. What was my sister's name? Where had I been driving from? Who was Daniel Hayes? The questions beat in my head with each footfall, and I realized with growing horror that I was beginning to forget why I wanted to leave Emberwick at all. Do you know what it feels like to have your identity slowly erased, like footprints in sand being washed away by the tide? We ran through streets that twisted and turned without warning, the architecture around us shifting between decades. Victorian houses would suddenly sport satellite dishes, while modern storefronts crumbled into colonial facades. The yellow-green mist swirled thicker, sometimes parting to reveal glimpses of the townsfolk pursuing us, their movements becoming increasingly unnatural. "Don't look at them," Elle panted beside me. "And don't listen if they call your name." As if on cue, a voice drifted through the mist, my mother's voice, though she had passed away 5 years ago. "Daniel, honey? Where are you going? Come home." I faltered, my steps slowing involuntarily. The voice was so perfect, so achingly familiar. Elle's grip on my arm tightened painfully. "It's not real," she hissed. "The town uses what you love against you." I forced myself to keep moving, though each step felt heavier than the last. The clock tower loomed ahead, seeming both impossibly far and unnervingly close, its proportions shifting with each blink of my eyes. The strange symbols on its face rotated counterclockwise, while the hands spun rapidly in the opposite direction. "What is this place?" I gasped. "Really?" Elle didn't answer immediately, pulling me into a narrow alley as a group of townsfolk shambled past the entrance, their heads rotating in unison like birds of prey. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Emberwick exists in what you might call a fold in time," she explained. "It's not quite in your world anymore, but it's not entirely separate either. It sits at a crossroads of sorts." "A crossroads of what?" "Of when and where. Of was and might be." Elle peered around the corner, checking if the way was clear. "The town was normal once, a long time ago. Until the incident at the clock tower in 1932. We emerged from the alley onto a small square dominated by a dried-up fountain. The stone figure at its center, what might once have been an angel, was now twisted into an impossible shape, its wings melded with its face, its arms spiraling around its torso like vines." "What happened in 1932? I asked, trying not to look directly at the disturbing sculpture. "A physicist named Dr. Edmund Thorne was conducting experiments with time," Elle replied, leading me across the square toward a narrow street that seemed to lead directly to the base of the clock tower. "He believed he could create a device that would allow people to observe the past without interacting with it. A window through time, not a door." The bell tolled again, the sound distorting the air like heat waves rising from hot pavement. Cracks formed in the cobblestones beneath our feet, revealing not earth or stone beneath, but glimpses of other places, other times, a dirt road with horse-drawn carriages, a paved highway with modern cars, a forest path unmarked by human presence. "His laboratory was in the clock tower," Elle continued, her pace quickening. "Something went wrong during a test. There was an explosion, but not the kind that destroys matter, the kind that destroys the boundaries between moments in time. We reached the base of the clock tower, a Gothic structure that stretched impossibly high, its upper portions disappearing into churning clouds. The entrance was a heavy oak door reinforced with iron bands, locked with a mechanism that resembled both an ancient padlock and a digital keypad. Elle placed her hand against the door, closing her eyes in concentration. Emberwick and everyone in it was caught in the blast radius. The town became unstuck, slipping between different points in its own timeline, sometimes merging them together. The lock clicked, and the door swung inward with a groan of protest. Inside was a cavernous space filled with the inner workings of the clock, massive gears and counterweights moving in patterns that defied mechanical logic, some turning while phasing partially through others as if they existed in different planes of reality. "Most of the townsfolk don't realize what's happened to them," Elle said as we stepped inside, the door swinging shut behind us with ominous finality. "They're caught in loops, repeating variations of the same actions they were performing when the accident occurred." Sheriff Moore was investigating disappearances. Joe was serving coffee. The librarian was cataloging new acquisitions. And you? I asked, following her up a narrow spiral staircase that wound around the outer wall of the tower. How did you get here? Why are you caught in a loop like the others? Elle's steps faltered for a moment. I came here in 1996 with my parents. We were on a camping trip, got lost in a storm. Found Emberwick the same way you did. Her voice grew distant. They became part of it quickly. Within days, they were like the others, repeating the same patterns, forgetting who they had been. But not you. Some people are resistant. Elle resumed climbing. Ms. Blackwood calls it being temporally anchored. Something in our minds helps us hold on to who we are, even as the town tries to erase and rewrite us. The staircase seemed to go on forever, each turn revealing another identical section above. The bell tolled again, closer now, the vibrations nearly knocking us off the steps. How many others like us are there? I asked, breath coming in short gasps as we climbed higher. There were 8 when I first arrived, Elle said. Now there's just me and Ms. Blackwood. And you, if you can hold on to yourself long enough. We emerged onto a landing where the staircase terminated at another door, this one made of brass, etched with mathematical equations and diagrams. Elle produced another key, this one looking more like a strange brass instrument than a conventional key. Dr. Thorne's laboratory, she explained. The heart of the anomaly. The key turned with a sound like distant thunder, and the door swung open to reveal a vast circular chamber that couldn't possibly fit within the dimensions of the tower as viewed from outside. The walls were lined with blackboards covered in equations and diagrams. Brass and copper instruments of indeterminate purpose cluttered workbenches. At the center of the room stood what appeared to be a telescope mounted on a complex framework of gears and crystals, pointed not at a window, but at a large circular mirror suspended from the ceiling. His time-viewing apparatus, Elle explained, approaching the strange device with a mixture of reverence and caution. Dr. Thorne called it the chronoscope. It was designed to focus temporal energy through those crystals, creating a window into specific moments in the past. I stared at the machine, its brass components gleaming despite the decades of abandonment. And this is what caused the accident? Yes and no. Elle ran her fingers along the telescope-like viewer, clearing away a thin film of dust. The machine worked, according to Miss Blackwood. Thorne successfully created windows into the past. The problem came when he tried to view the future. Above us, the great bell began to toll again, each resonant boom causing the instruments in the laboratory to vibrate in sympathy. Through the windows that ringed the upper portion of the chamber, I could see the strange mist pressing against the glass like curious fingers. Looking backward is one thing, Elle continued, moving to a console covered in dials and levers. The past has already happened, it's fixed in a way. But the future is still forming, still in flux. When Thorne pointed his machine forward in time, he created a paradox. A paradox? He saw futures that couldn't exist if he'd seen them, Elle explained, adjusting settings on the console. The act of observation changed the outcome. It created a feedback loop that tore the fabric of time around Emberwick. The town became caught in that loop, cycling through its own past, present, and possible futures, never fully existing in any one moment. The overhead mirror began to rotate slowly, catching the light from outside and reflecting it down into the crystalline array mounted above the viewing apparatus. Colors danced across the walls, not just the visible spectrum, but hues I had no names for, that seemed to exist between and beyond the colors I knew. Why are you showing me this? I asked, feeling a strange pressure building behind my eyes as I watched the play of impossible colors. Because you need to understand what you're up against, Elle said, her voice taking on a new urgency. The town isn't just a place, Daniel. It's become a sort of entity. It's aware, and it feeds on new arrivals like you and me. Feeds? On what? On possibilities, Elle said grimly. On the futures we might have had if we hadn't come here. On the lives we would have lived. It consumes them, incorporates them into its own fractured timeline. The mirror's rotation increased, the colors intensifying, swirling into patterns that hurt to look at directly. The pressure in my head grew, and with it came flashes of memory, not just my own, but others. A young woman in 1970s clothing celebrating her college graduation, a man in a Civil War uniform writing a letter by candlelight, a child from what looked like the 22nd century playing with a toy that glowed and changed shape in their hands. What's happening? I gasped, clutching my head. The chronoscope is showing you the temporal layers of Emberwick, Elle explained, adjusting more controls. Every person who's ever been trapped here has left their imprint. Their memories, their experiences, their potential futures, all of it woven into the fabric of the town. The images came faster now, overwhelming in their intensity, hundreds, thousands of lives flickering through my consciousness, too rapid to process individually but leaving behind a profound sense of loss and grief. Make it stop, I pleaded, falling to my knees. Elle switched off the device, and the colors faded, the mirror slowing its rotation until it hung motionless once more. The pressure in my head receded, but the echoes of those countless lives remained, a hollow ache behind my sternum. I'm sorry, Elle said, helping me to my feet. But you needed to feel it to understand. That's what's happening to you already. The town is beginning to absorb who you are, who you might have been. I thought of my sister, whose face I could no longer clearly picture, whose name hovered just beyond reach. I thought of my job, my home, my life outside Emberwick, all of it growing hazier by the minute. How do we stop it? I asked. Elle's expression hardened with determination. We have to reverse the paradox. Reset the machine. Can that be done? Theoretically. The original accident created a temporal displacement wave that swept outward from this tower. If we can create another wave of precise, opposing frequency. She trailed off, moving to one of the blackboards and scanning the equations written there. What would happen? I pressed. Best case? The town snaps back into normal time, and anyone not anchored here originally returns to when and where they came from. And worst case? Elle didn't answer immediately, her fingers tracing the complex mathematics on the blackboard. Worst case, we accelerate the town's temporal decay. Everything here, including us, dissolves into the void between moments. From outside the tower came a sound like glass breaking, followed by a chorus of moans that seemed to emanate from multiple throats speaking in unison. The townsfolk have found us. They know what we're planning, Elle said, moving faster now, gathering components from around the laboratory. The town won't let us try without a fight. Something heavy slammed against the brass door, causing it to bulge inwards slightly despite its apparent solidity. Another impact followed, and another, each one leaving the door more distorted than before. We don't have much time, Elle said, the irony of her words not lost on me. I need to modify the chronoscope to generate an inverse wave. You need to hold them off. Ow! I asked, panic rising in my throat as the door buckled further. Elle pointed to a cabinet against the wall. Thorne kept weapons. He was paranoid about government agents stealing his research. I yanked open the cabinet to find an assortment of antique firearms, revolvers, hunting rifles, even what appeared to be a blunderbuss. I grabbed a revolver that looked to be from the early 1900s, checking to see if it was loaded. 6 brass cartridges gleamed in the cylinder. Will these even work against whatever they are now? I asked. They're not ghosts, Al said, removing crystals from the chronoscope and rearranging them in a new configuration. They're still physical, just temporarily unstable. Hit them, and they'll be disrupted for a while. It won't kill them, I'm not sure anything can anymore, but it will slow them down. The door gave way with a screech of tearing metal. Through the jagged opening poured the residents of Emberwick, or what had once been residents. Their forms flickered and shifted, sometimes appearing as they had in the cafe, sometimes as decayed corpses, sometimes as translucent outlines filled with swirling mist. Sheriff Moore led them, his face contorted with rage that transcended humanity, his movements a stuttering, frame-by-frame progression across the room. Behind him came Joe from the cafe, the chess player Maxwell, the elderly newspaper reader, all of them moving with that same wrong gait, their eyes fixed on us with primal hunger. I raised the revolver and fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space, the recoil stronger than I expected. Sheriff Moore's chest erupted in a spray of yellow-green mist rather than blood. He staggered backward but didn't fall, the wound already closing as the mist coalesced back into solid form. Keep firing. Elle shouted over the din, her hands moving with frantic precision among the components of the chronoscope. Aim for the head or heart. I fired again and again, each shot temporarily disrupting one of the advancing figures but never stopping them permanently. They would dissolve into mist, then reform seconds later, closer than before. The revolver clicked empty after 6 shots. Elle, I'm out of ammunition. Cabinet to your left, ammo box on the second shelf, she called back, not looking up from her work. I lunged for the cabinet, yanking open the door and grabbing a wooden box of cartridges. My hands shook as I tried to reload, dropping several bullets that rolled across the floor with a sound like tiny bells. The first of the townsfolk reached me before I could finish reloading, Maxwell, the chess player, his face now a blur of features that shifted between young man, middle-aged adult, and withered elder in the space of seconds. His hands closed around my throat, impossibly strong. The touch burned like dry ice, a cold so intense it felt like fire. Where his fingers made contact, I could feel my own temporal stability wavering, my skin aging and rejuvenating rapidly, memories flooding and receding in waves. I was 5 years old at my birthday party. I was 40 and watching a sunset from a porch I'd never owned. I was 92 and dying in a hospital bed surrounded by faces I didn't recognize. With a desperate effort, I broke free of his grip and stumbled backward, finally managing to reload the revolver. I fired point blank into Maxwell's face, watching as his head temporarily dissolved into swirling mist before beginning to reform. Elle, whatever you're doing, do it faster. I shouted, backing toward the chronoscope as the horde of townsfolk advanced in their jerky, time-skipping movement. Almost there, she called back, making a final adjustment to the device. The crystals were now arranged in a pattern inverse to their original configuration, and she was rewiring the power source, connecting it directly to the massive gears of the clock mechanism that surrounded the laboratory. I continued firing, creating momentary gaps in the advancing wall of temporal abominations, but they closed ranks quickly, the disrupted individuals reforming and rejoining the search. And with each passing moment, I could feel my own identity slipping further away. My name, was it Daniel? David? I couldn't be sure anymore. My purpose here, my life before Emberwick, all of it growing dim and distant like stars at dawn. Sheriff Moore stepped over the dissolving form of one of his fellows, his badge now a shapeless lump of corroded metal pinned to a uniform that shifted between styles spanning a century of law enforcement. When he spoke, his voice was a chorus of different tones and accents, as if multiple people were speaking through him simultaneously. "You cannot leave," the voices intoned. "You are Emberwick now. You have always been Emberwick." "Not yet," I snarled, firing my last bullet into his face. As Moore's features dissolved into mist, Elle gave a triumphant cry. "It's ready. Get back." I stumbled to her side as she threw a final switch. The chronoscope hummed to life, the crystals vibrating at a frequency that set my teeth on edge. The mirror above began to spin once more, but instead of reflecting light, it now seemed to be absorbing it, drawing in the strange colors from the air and concentrating them into a beam that shot downward into the heart of the machine. The townsfolk sensed the danger, their advance becoming more frenzied. Hands reached for us, young hands, old hands, skeletal hands, all flickering between states of being as they clawed at the air mere feet from where we stood. When I activate the final sequence, Elle shouted over the growing whine of the machine, "There will be a moment of temporal instability. You need to focus on who you are, where you came from. Hold on to that with everything you have, or you'll be lost in the reset." I nodded, desperately trying to gather the tatters of my identity. Daniel Hayes. I was Daniel Hayes. I was driving to see my sister, Elaine Hayes, in Millbrook. I lived in. The gaps in my memory yawned like open wounds. "Now!" Elle cried, slamming her palm down on a brass plate at the base of the chronoscope. The world went white, then black, then every color at once. I felt myself being torn apart at the atomic level, each particle of my being separated from the others and suspended in a void beyond time. In that endless moment, I saw Emberwick as it truly was, not a town, but a wound in reality, a cancerous growth on the fabric of space-time that consumed and corrupted everything it touched. And I saw Elle, her form similarly dissected, her being spread across the temporal spectrum. But unlike me, she was not whole. Parts of her had already been absorbed by Emberwick, integrated into its fractured timeline. She was anchored here, just as she had said, but not in the way I had understood. She was part of the town now, had been for decades. "Find the way back," her voice echoed in the non-space between moments. "Remember who you are." I tried to hold on to the fragments of my identity as the temporal wave expanded outward from the clock tower, rippling through Emberwick, tearing apart the paradox that had sustained it for so long. The pressure was enormous, like being at the bottom of the ocean. My consciousness began to fade, blackness encroaching at the edges of my perception. The last thing I heard before surrendering to the void was Elle's voice, growing fainter with each word. "Some of us can never leave. But you still can. Find your way home, Daniel Hayes. Find your way home." And then, nothing. Have you ever woken from a dream so vivid you couldn't tell if you were still asleep? That moment of uncertainty when reality hasn't quite reasserted itself? I came back to consciousness in fragments. First sound, a steady, rhythmic beeping. Then sensation, scratchy sheets beneath me, a dull ache throughout my body. Smell, antiseptic and something floral. And finally, sight, as I pried my heavy eyelids open to a white ceiling and fluorescent lights. A hospital room. I was in a hospital bed, and Ford drip in my arm, monitoring equipment beside me explaining the beeping. Sunlight streamed through half-drawn blinds, casting stripes across the institutional blue blanket covering my legs. "He's awake," someone exclaimed, a familiar voice, female, thick with emotion. A face appeared above me, my sister Elaine, her features now crystal clear in my mind, no longer the blurry half-remembered image from Emberwick. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, her blonde hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. "Dan," she whispered, gripping my hand tightly. "You're back. God, you're really back." I tried to speak, but my throat was parched, my voice emerging as a rasp. "Water." Elaine quickly poured a cup from a plastic pitcher, helping me sip through a straw. The cold liquid was blissful against my raw throat. "What happened?" I managed after a moment. "You crashed," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "On the mountain road. Your car went off the edge. A hiker found you 2 days later, half a mile from the wreckage. The doctors say it's a miracle you survived." 2 days. Had it only been 2 days? My time in Emberwick had felt like weeks. "How long have I been here?" I asked. 3 days in the ICU, then they moved you here yesterday when your condition stabilized." Elaine brushed hair back from my forehead with a trembling hand. "You had a concussion, 3 broken ribs, and hypothermia. They weren't sure if—" She trailed off, eyes welling with tears. "They weren't sure if you'd wake up." I tried to reconcile this information with my memories of Emberwick, the cafe, the library, the clock tower, and all. Had it all been a hallucination brought on by the crash and head injury? A dream my unconscious mind had spun while my body lay broken in a hospital bed? "I had the strangest dream," I said, the words feeling inadequate for the experience I'd had. Elaine smiled, patting my hand. "The doctors said you might be confused when you woke up. Just rest now. I'll let them know you're awake." She pressed the call button, and soon the room filled with medical personnel, doctors checking my vitals, nurses adjusting my fore, a neurologist shining a pen light in my eyes and asking me to follow her finger. "Remarkable recovery," the neurologist commented, making notes on a tablet. "Your brain activity was highly unusual during the coma. Almost as if you were experiencing REM sleep continuously for days." "I was somewhere else," I said hesitantly, unsure how much to share. "A town called Emberwick." The doctor nodded, her expression professionally neutral. "The brain creates elaborate scenarios to process trauma sometimes. Nothing to worry about. The most important thing is that you're awake and responding well." After the medical staff left, promising to return for more tests later, Elaine sat beside my bed, filling me in on what I'd missed. How the search parties had combed the mountainside. How they'd found my car, crumpled at the bottom of a ravine, initially assuming no one could have survived the impact. How a hiker had stumbled across me, delirious and injured but somehow alive, nearly half a mile from the crash site. "You kept saying the same thing over and over," Elaine said, her brow furrowed. "Something about clock tower and time being broken. The paramedics thought you were just confused from the concussion." I felt a chill run down my spine despite the warmth of the hospital room. Maybe I was. But that night, after Elaine had gone home with promises to return in the morning, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling as memories of Emberwick played through my mind with perfect clarity. No matter how I tried to dismiss them as dreams or hallucinations, they refused to fade or warp as dreams normally do upon waking. They remained sharp, detailed, more vivid than some of my real memories. The newspaper in the cafe, dated 1978, with my college professor's face in the photograph. The window in the bathroom that looked into a classroom from the 1950s. The record in the library archive with my name written in fresh ink. Elle's face as she explained the paradox at the heart of the clock tower. I was still pondering these memories when I noticed something on the bedside table that hadn't been there before, a small, leather-bound book with no title on its spine. I reached for it, wincing at the pain in my ribs, and opened it to the first page. The temporal mechanics of interspatial anomalies was written in a precise, scholarly hand, followed by Edmund Thorne, Ph.D., 1932. My heart began to race, setting off alarms on the monitoring equipment. A nurse rushed in, concern etched on her face. "Mr. Hayes? Are you all right?" I quickly slipped the book under my blanket. "Just a bad dream," I lied. "I'm fine." The nurse adjusted something on my foretrip. "This should help you sleep. Try to rest now." After she left, I retrieved the book and thumbed through its pages with trembling hands. Diagrams of the chronoscope. Equations describing temporal displacement waves. Observations about the nature of time as a fluid rather than linear dimension. It was all here, everything Al had tried to explain in the clock tower laboratory. On the final page was a handwritten note in different handwriting. "Daniel, some of us can never leave, but parts of us can. You made it out. Don't come looking for Emberwick again. It knows you now." Sleep was impossible after that. Whenever I closed my eyes, I saw Sheriff Moore's face shifting between decades, or the black-eyed children in the classroom, or the townsfolk advancing with their wrong, stuttering movements. I watched the sun rise through the hospital window, the book clutched tightly in my hands, wondering if I was losing my mind or if I had glimpsed a reality beyond normal perception. The doctors released me 3 days later, satisfied with my recovery but puzzled by my elevated stress levels and racing thoughts. Elaine drove me to her home in Millbrook, her constant worried glances making it clear she thought I was still affected by the accident. "The guest room is all ready for you," she said as we pulled into her driveway. "You can stay as long as you need to recover." Her house was comfortable, normal, a welcome change from the unsettling wrongness of Emberwick. I tried to settle into recovery, taking my medication, resting, letting my broken bones heal. But my thoughts kept returning to the book, which I read obsessively, trying to understand the physics behind what I had experienced. And then came the dreams. Unlike my vivid memories of Emberwick, these were fragmented, disjointed glimpses of the town seen through different eyes. A young woman in 1970s clothing walking through the town square. A Civil War soldier writing letters in a boarding house. A child playing with a futuristic toy in a home that seemed both familiar and strange. The same people I had glimpsed through the chronoscope, their lives and memories bleeding into my unconscious mind. Each morning I woke exhausted, as if I had lived entire lifetimes in my sleep. 2 weeks after coming to stay with Elaine, I found myself at her computer while she was at work, searching for information about Emberwick. There was nothing, no record of a town by that name in the region, no historical references, no news articles. It was as if the place had never existed. But when I searched for Edmund Thorne, I found a single reference, a short obituary from 1932 in the archives of a regional newspaper. "Brilliant physicist dies in laboratory accident," read the headline. The article mentioned Thorne's work in temporal mechanics and observational theory, but gave no details about the accident that claimed his life. My hand hovered over the keyboard, tempted to search for Eleanor L., but I stopped myself. What would I search for? I didn't even know her last name. And part of me feared what I might find, an obituary from 1996, perhaps, for a teenager who had disappeared during a family camping trip. Instead, I found myself looking up information about the mountain road where I had crashed. It was a notorious stretch of highway, it turned out, with an unusually high accident rate. Local legends spoke of drivers experiencing lost time there or seeing things that couldn't be explained. One forum post caught my eye, a hiker describing a strange experience from 5 years earlier. They had been walking an unmarked trail when the mist had rolled in, thicker than seemed natural. When it cleared, they found themselves on the outskirts of a small town that didn't appear on any maps. They had only stayed long enough to notice the unsettling atmosphere and the strange behavior of the locals before fleeing back the way they had come. I knew something was wrong when I saw the clock tower, the post read. Its face had symbols instead of numbers, and the hands were moving backward. My heart pounded as I read and reread those words. It wasn't just me. Emberwick was real, or as real as a place caught in a temporal paradox could be. I began to heal physically, but my mind remained consumed by Emberwick. I scoured the internet for similar accounts, for scientific papers on temporal anomalies, for anything that might help me understand what had happened to me. Elaine grew increasingly concerned, especially when she caught me drawing diagrams from Thorne's book or muttering about time waves and paradoxes. "You need to talk to someone professional about this," she said one evening after finding me surrounded by printouts of physics papers. The accident was traumatic. It's normal to have psychological effects afterward. "I'm not crazy," I insisted. "It happened, Elaine. I was there. In a town that doesn't exist, with people caught in a time loop." She sighed, sitting beside me on the couch. "Listen to yourself, Dan. The doctors warned us about this. Sometimes the brain creates elaborate scenarios during trauma. It feels real to you, but it's just your mind trying to process what happened." I wanted to believe her. It would have been easier to accept that Emberwick was a hallucination, that Elle and the others were figments of my imagination. But the book remained solid in my hands, undeniable evidence that something had followed me back from that impossible place. A month after the accident, I was strong enough to return to my own apartment. Elaine was reluctant to see me leave, but I assured her I was fine, that the delusions were fading. It was easier to lie than to see the worry in her eyes. Back in my own space, I set up what Elaine would have called a conspiracy wall, maps of the mountain region, printouts of accident reports from the area, notes from Thorne's book, my own sketches of Emberwick and its residents. I began to see patterns, clusters of incidents spanning decades, all centered around a specific area of the mountains where no town officially existed. And I began to notice other things, small temporal disturbances in my daily life. A watch that ran backward for exactly 12 minutes every day at 3:17 p.m. A mirror that sometimes showed my reflection with a slight delay, as if the image were struggling to catch up with my movements. A patch of wall in my bedroom that, when viewed from the corner of my eye, appeared to be a window looking out onto a cobblestone street. Emberwick was reaching for me, tendrils of its fractured reality extending into my world. Or perhaps parts of me remained anchored there, creating bridges between here and there. The dreams intensified. No longer just glimpses of other lives, but fully formed narratives. I was Edmund Thorne, making the final adjustments to the chronoscope, filled with the certainty that I was about to change science forever. I was Sheriff Moore, investigating the disappearance of hikers in the mountains, unaware that I was about to become part of the very mystery I sought to solve. I was Joe, serving coffee in the timeless cup, noticing with growing unease that the same customers had been coming in at the same time for weeks, saying the same things, never aging. Most frequently, I was Elle, arriving in Emberwick as a teenager, watching my parents slowly forget who they were, discovering Miss Blackwood in the library, learning the truth about the town that had ensnared us. Living years, decades, in a place that ate away at my identity one memory at a time, fighting to hold on to enough of myself to help the next visitor who might have a chance of escape. I woke from these dreams feeling as if I had lived other lives, my sense of self becoming increasingly fluid. Was I Daniel Hayes, or was that just the most recent identity I had worn? How much of me had been left behind in Emberwick? How much of Emberwick had come back with me? At night, I would sometimes catch glimpses of the yellow-green mist curling under my door or around the edges of my windows. Once, I woke to find Sheriff Moore standing at the foot of my bed, his form flickering between decades, his badge a corroded lump of metal. He vanished when I switched on the light, but the impression of his wrongness lingered. I began to wonder if the temporal wave that El had triggered with the reverse chronoscope hadn't fully released me. Perhaps I was still partly caught in Emberwick's paradox, existing in two places at once, my consciousness split between normal reality and that fold in time where the town existed. 2 months after my return, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a small brass key, identical to the one El had used to unlock the clock tower laboratory. A note accompanied it, written in the same hand as the message at the back of Thorne's book. The town is growing. The paradox is spreading. We need your help. Bring the book. That night, I dreamed of the library again, but it was different now, the shelves half empty, books lying in disarray on the floor. Ms. Blackwood stood amid the chaos, her normally composed features drawn with worry. The reset failed, she said, addressing me as if I were actually present. The wave inverted the paradox temporarily, but it's reasserting itself. Expanding. The boundaries are thinning. What can I do? I asked, my dream self-aware in a way that is rarely possible in normal dreams. You're anchored in both worlds now, Ms. Blackwood replied. A bridge. If you come back with the book, with Thorne's original calculations, we might be able to create a more permanent solution. I woke with a start, the brass key clutched in my hand, though I was certain I had left it on my bedside table. Outside my window, the morning appeared normal, sunny, cars passing on the street below, a neighbor walking her dog. But in the reflection of the glass, barely perceptible, I could see the outline of Emberwick's clock tower superimposed over the cityscape. The boundaries were thinning indeed. I spent the day in a daze, torn between fear of returning to Emberwick and the growing conviction that I had no choice. If the temporal paradox was expanding, if the town was somehow reaching into the normal world, how long before other places, other people, were caught in its distortion? And there was Elle to consider. She had helped me escape, had perhaps sacrificed her own chance at freedom to ensure mine. Could I abandon her to an eternity of temporal limbo? That evening, I packed a small bag, flashlight, water, first aid kit, and most importantly, Thorne's book. I left a note for Elaine explaining that I needed to take a trip to clear my head, promising to return soon. I didn't tell her where I was going. How could I? The drive to the mountain road where I had crashed took just over 2 hours. I parked at a scenic overlook about a mile from the site of my accident, not wanting to risk driving any further. The sun was setting as I shouldered my backpack and began hiking up the trail that paralleled the highway. The mist descended as if on cue, rolling in from between the trees with unnatural speed and purpose. I felt a momentary panic, an urge to turn back while I still could. But then I thought of Elle, of the residents of Emberwick trapped in their endless loops, and of the possibility that their condition might begin to spread beyond the town's borders. I took a deep breath and stepped forward into the thickening fog, feeling the brass key grow warm in my pocket. The world around me began to shift, trees and rocks fading into ghostly outlines before disappearing altogether. For a time, I walked through pure whiteness, with no sense of direction or distance. Then the mist began to clear, and I found myself standing at the edge of a familiar valley. Below me lay Emberwick, but it had changed since my last visit. The neat grid of streets was now distorted, buildings overlapping in impossible ways, some structures partly transparent, revealing others behind them as if multiple versions of the town were trying to occupy the same space. The clock tower still dominated the skyline, but it now seemed to exist in several places at once, its image repeating across the town like a visual echo. The symbols on its face glowed with an eerie blue light visible even from this distance. I made my way down the winding road toward the town, noting other changes as I drew closer. The mist that had been white before was now tinted with that sickly yellow-green hue I had seen during my escape. It clung to the ground in patches, swirling around certain buildings more densely than others. The welcome sign at the town's edge was now split down the middle, each half showing a different version of the town's name, Emberwick on one side, and something written in symbols I couldn't decipher on the other. The population tally marks had multiplied, spilling off the sign and onto the post that supported it. The streets were no longer empty. Figures moved through the town, some solid and normal looking, others transparent or glitching between different appearances. None seemed to notice me as I made my way toward the center of town, toward the library where I hoped to find Elle or Miss Blackwood. I passed the timeless cup, now existing in at least 3 different architectural styles simultaneously, a Victorian tea shop, a 1950s diner, and a modern cafe. Through the windows, I could see multiple versions of Joe serving customers who flickered in and out of visibility. The library, when I reached it, appeared to be the most stable building in town, though even it showed signs of temporal decay, sections of wall that phased between stone, brick, and glass, a staircase that led up to a second floor in one moment and down to a basement the next. I pushed open the heavy doors, relieved to find them solid beneath my hands. Inside, the vast space was as I remembered it, though the destruction I had seen in my dream was now reality. Books scattered across the floor, shelves tilted at precarious angles, artifacts from the collection broken and discarded. Elle? I called out, my voice echoing strangely in the cavernous room. Miss Blackwood? Movement from between the stacks caught my eye, a tall, thin figure emerging from the shadows. But it wasn't Elle or the librarian. It was Sheriff Moore, his uniform now a patchwork of different time periods, his face cycling through expressions of confusion, anger, and something that might have been fear. You came back, he said, his voice overlapping with itself, creating an unsettling chorus effect. No one comes back voluntarily. I took a step backward, reaching for the door handle behind me. I'm looking for Elle. Or Miss Blackwood. The librarian is gone, Moore said, taking a step forward. Disappeared when the tower began to duplicate. The girl. He paused, his form flickering briefly into something less human, more abstract. The girl is at the clock tower. Always at the clock tower now. Before I could respond, Moore's form began to unravel, not dissolving into mist as before, but separating into strands of matter that stretched and thinned until he was gone entirely, leaving only the echo of his voice. They're waiting for you. I stood frozen for a moment, processing what I had seen. The sheriff's disintegration seemed different from the temporary disruption caused by the revolver in the clock tower laboratory. This was more final. As if the temporal fabric holding him together had simply given up. Was this what Miss Blackwood had meant by the paradox reasserting itself? Was Emberwick not just trapping people in loops, but beginning to break down the very concept of consistent existence? With a renewed sense of urgency, I left the library and made my way toward the clock tower, or towers, as there now appeared to be at least 4 versions of the structure visible from different angles, each slightly out of phase with the others. As I drew closer, the versions seemed to converge, overlapping until they formed a single building. The versions of the clock tower converged into a single building as I approached, its architecture shifting subtly with each step. The symbols on its face pulsed with an intensity that seemed almost desperate, like a heartbeat growing erratic. The brass door that had been damaged during our escape was now fully restored, though it appeared to vibrate slightly, as if struggling to maintain its form. I withdrew the key from my pocket, warm now, almost hot to the touch, and inserted it into the lock. It turned with surprising ease, the mechanism clicking open as if welcoming me back. Inside, the spiral staircase wound upward just as I remembered, but now each step seemed to exist in multiple versions of itself, creating a vertigo-inducing visual effect. I gripped the railing tightly as I climbed, feeling the metal shift between cold iron, polished brass, and something that felt almost organic beneath my fingers. The laboratory at the top was transformed. The orderly, steampunk-inspired space I remembered had expanded impossibly, the ceiling now so high it disappeared into shadow. The gears of the clock mechanism had multiplied, some spinning forward, others backward, creating a cacophony of ticking that resonated in my chest like a second heartbeat. And there, bent over the chronoscope at the center of the room, was Elle. She looked up as I entered, her face lighting with recognition tinged with sorrow. She appeared both older and younger than when I'd last seen her, her features cycling subtly through different ages, though settling most often on the young woman I remembered. "Daniel," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around us. "You got my message." "I brought the book," I replied, pulling Thorne's journal from my backpack and holding it out to her. Elle crossed the room to take it, her movements leaving trailing after images in the air. When our hands touched during the exchange, I felt a jolt of connection, memories that weren't mine flooding my consciousness momentarily. I saw her arrival in Emberwick as a teenager, her gradual realization of the town's nature, years of research in this very tower. "The paradox is collapsing," she said, already flipping through the book's pages with urgent purpose. "When we inverted the chronoscope, we didn't just reset the loop, we destabilized it. The town is trying to exist in too many states simultaneously." "I've seen it," I said. "Buildings overlapping, people unraveling." Sheriff Moore just disappeared in front of me at the library. Elle nodded grimly. "The temporal anchors are failing. People who've been here the longest are the first to go. Ms. Blackwood disappeared 3 days ago, or weeks, or years. Time is impossible to track now." She returned to the chronoscope, comparing Thorne's original notes to the modified device before her. "I've been trying to stabilize it, but nothing works. The town is expanding, reaching into the outside world. Soon it won't just be hikers and lost travelers being caught, entire regions could be pulled into the distortion." "What can we do?" I asked, approaching the chronoscope cautiously. It looked different now, the crystals arranged in a spiraling pattern, the mirror above replaced by what appeared to be a prism that refracted light into impossible colors. "Thorne's original calculations might be the key," Elle said, tracing a diagram in the book. "He designed the chronoscope to observe time, not manipulate it. The adjustments he made later, the ones that created the paradox, those were experimental and proven." She looked up at me, her eyes reflecting the strange light of the prism. "We need to reverse the process completely. Not just invert the wave, but collapse it entirely. Return the town to a singular temporal state." "Is that even possible? After all this time?" "Theoretically," Elle said, already beginning to rearrange components on the device. "But it will require an enormous amount of energy, more than the tower's mechanism can generate. And..." She hesitated, her expression grave. "It will require a focal point. Something, or someone, that exists in multiple temporal states to serve as a conduit. The implication hung in the air between us. I had been in Emberwick. I had left. Part of me remained anchored here, while my physical form had returned to the normal flow of time. I was a bridge between realities. You mean me, I said softly. Elle nodded, unable to meet my eyes. You're the only one who's successfully crossed the boundary in both directions. Your temporal signature is unique, fractured between here and there. What happens to me if we do this? Elle's form flickered momentarily, her younger self showing through more clearly. Best case? You return fully to your time, with Emberwick becoming nothing more than a distant memory. Worst case? We both know the worst case, I said, thinking of Sheriff Moore dissolving into nothing. Around us, the laboratory began to tremble, books falling from shelves, equipment sliding across tables. Through the windows, I could see the town below shifting more violently now, buildings phasing in and out of existence, streets rearranging themselves like pieces on a game board. We don't have much time, Elle said, working faster now. The paradox is approaching critical instability. I watched her work, marveling at the understanding she had gained of Thorne's creation. How long have you been here, Elle? Really? Her hands paused momentarily. I arrived in 1996. At least, that's when I think I arrived. But I've experienced. She struggled to find the words, centuries, perhaps. Time loops, alternate versions of days and years. I've read every book in the library 12 times. I've mapped every inch of this town across every era it exists in. And if we collapse the paradox, what happens to you? Elle resumed her work, her movements precise despite the laboratory's increasing instability. I've been part of Emberwick for too long. My original timeline, there's nothing left for me there. No one remembers me. I've checked. The sadness in her voice was palpable, and I felt a surge of guilt at my own chance of escape. There has to be another way. You helped me get out. There must be a way for you too. Physics doesn't care about fairness, Daniel, she said with a small smile. Some paradoxes can only be resolved one way. Before I could argue further, a violent tremor shook the tower, nearly knocking us off our feet. Through the windows, the sky above Emberwick had turned that sickly yellow-green color, swirling like a storm system centered directly above us. It's starting, Elle said, her voice tight with urgency. The collapse is accelerating. She made a final adjustment to the chronoscope, then stepped back, surveying her work. It's ready. I've reconfigured it according to Thorne's original design, but with modifications to channel the temporal energy inward instead of outward. What do I need to do? I asked. Elle pointed to a space directly beneath the prism. Stand there. When I activate the sequence, focus on your home, your real life. Think about the exact moment before you encountered Emberwick. Your identity, your memories, hold on to them with everything you have. I moved to the designated spot, feeling a strange tingling sensation as soon as I stepped into position. The air around me seemed to shimmer, reality itself growing thin. Whatever happens, Elle said, moving to the control panel, know that you gave us hope. For the first time in decades, you made me believe there was a world beyond Emberwick. That was a gift. She looked so young in that moment, so human despite the temporal distortions affecting her form. I wanted to say something meaningful, to thank her for saving me, to promise I would remember her. But before I could speak, she threw the switch. The prism above me flared with blinding intensity. I felt myself being pulled in 1,000 directions at once, my consciousness expanding to fill multiple timelines simultaneously. I was in the clock tower. I was on the mountain road. I was in the hospital bed. I was in Elaine's guest room. Through the kaleidoscope of my fractured perception, I saw Elle at the controls, her form now fully visible in multiple temporal states, a teenager newly arrived in town, a young woman discovering the secrets of the clock tower, an ageless guardian who had watched over Emberwick for longer than should have been possible. The chronoscope's hum rose to a piercing whine. The gears of the clock mechanism began to spin with impossible speed. The prism's light concentrated into a beam that shot downward, enveloping me completely. "Remember who you are," Elle's voice called through the maelstrom. I focused on my name. Daniel Hayes. My sister, Elaine. My apartment. My life before Emberwick. I pulled these pieces of identity around me like armor as the temporal wave crashed through the tower, through the town, through reality itself. In that explosive moment of paradox collapse, I glimpsed Emberwick's true nature, not just a town trapped in time, but a wound in the fabric of existence, a place where the laws of physics had been bent until they broke. And now that wound was closing, reality reasserting itself one final time. The last thing I saw before consciousness slipped away was Elle's face, peaceful now, accepting, as she mouthed what might have been goodbye or perhaps thank you. Then darkness. I awoke to the sound of birds. Sunlight filtered through pine branches above me, dappling the forest floor where I lay. My backpack served as an impromptu pillow, the contents spilled beside me, flashlight, water bottle, first aid kit. But no brass key. No leather-bound book. I sat up slowly, taking in my surroundings. I was in the woods near the mountain road, not far from where I had parked the previous evening. The mist that had enveloped me was gone, revealing a clear, crisp morning. My phone showed service, and the date, only one night had passed in the real world. A dozen missed calls from Elaine lit up the screen. I stood on shaky legs and gathered my scattered belongings. As I zipped the backpack closed, I noticed something, a small tear in the lining that hadn't been there before. Reaching inside, my fingers found a folded piece of paper tucked into the tear. I withdrew it carefully and unfolded it to reveal a sketch, the clock tower of Emberwick, rendered in precise detail. At the bottom, in Elle's handwriting, "Time is not a line but a circle. Perhaps someday it will bring you back around. Until then, live well in your singular moment. I stood there for a long time, holding the paper, feeling the morning breeze against my face. There was no sign of Emberwick, no mysterious mist, no glimpse of buildings in the valley below, no echo of the clock tower's chimes. Just the normal, everyday world, proceeding 1 second at a time in the right order. Had I truly collapsed a temporal paradox? Had Emberwick ever existed beyond my imagination? The paper in my hand suggested it had, but even that could be explained away, a note I've written myself during my obsession, forgotten until now. Yet something had changed within me. I could feel it, a certainty about the fragility of time, about the thin boundaries between moments. A sense that reality was more malleable than most people ever realized. I folded the paper carefully and tucked it into my wallet. Then I began to hike back to my car, already composing explanations for Elaine in my head. I would tell her I needed closure, that I had faced my fears by returning to the crash site. I would not mention Emberwick, or Elle, or the clock tower that may have existed only in a fold of time now smoothed away. As I reached the scenic overlook where I parked, I paused to look back at the forested valley one last time. For just a moment, so briefly I might have imagined it, I thought I heard the distant sound of a clock striking the hour, its chimes echoing across an impossible distance. Then it was gone, leaving only the wind in the trees and the steady, reliable flow of time, carrying me forward toward home. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.